July 20th, 2008. It's a lazy Sunday afternoon in the New York borough of Brooklyn. Crystal Wright is in the middle of a catnap when she's jolted awake by someone pounding on her door.
It's a neighbor, and she tells me that some man is choking my child outside.
Somebody is hurting your daughter. I need you to pray for somebody is hurting your daughter.
Unsure which of her two daughters might be in trouble, Crystal races downstairs.
People are saying, he's across the street, right there. He's running.
He ran that way.
Crystal chases after the assailant.
Hey, wait! Stop!
I'm yelling, hey, hey. And he doesn't turn around. He just keeps moving.
Wait! Stop! Hey! You!
I don't know who this man is, but he ain't getting away. He slows down and he stops and he bends down.
At first, the man's back is to Crystal. But as he stands up, he turns to face her. Crystal can't believe her eyes.
I was shocked. I felt like betrayed. It was very difficult. Very, very difficult.
A resident of the Brooklyn neighborhood of Bushwick, Crystal Wright worked diligently to provide for her 3 children. And though son Dewan and daughters Denitra and Kanisha are well-behaved, Crystal keeps them on a tight leash.
My children said that I'm a strict mom. I thought that, you shouldn't go outside unless your homework was completed. They had to come in at a certain hour, it's rough around in this neighborhood.
Crystal's oldest daughter, Denitra, is shy and quiet, but also exceptionally bright. Crystal makes sure that with Denitra, school always comes first, and dating is pretty much out of the question.
Not many of her girlfriends got out of high school. Babies become parents at a very early age, and we were trying to make sure that wasn't happening with her.
Not that Denitra is a wallflower. She has plenty of close friends, including her childhood confidant, Tiffany Page. In 2003, at one of Tiffany's family functions, Denitra bumps into a tall, handsome stranger.
Meet my friend Demetria.
Hey, how are you? How are you?
I'm good, how are you?
Tiffany introduces him as her cousin, 29-year-old Jason Page. Despite the age difference, Denitra and Jason make an immediate connection.
Jason was sweet, he was sensitive. He made me laugh a lot, and I thought that was nice.
Jason asked for Denitra's number.
I tell you what, we need to get together. Me and you need to hang out, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I don't know about that.
With her parents' strict dating policy and their 12-year age gap, Denitra turns Jason down flat.
I'll see you around.
You see me around?
Yeah.
I felt he was way older than me. I was only 17 and he was 30.
In the spring of 2003, Denitra graduates high school and launches a career as a healthcare provider.
Hi,
What's
how are
up?
Over the next few years, she occasionally bumps into Jason. The chemistry between the two is always palpable. And in 2006, Jason finally makes his feelings for Denitra clear.
Just let me take you out. You'll have a good time. You ain't never meet a guy like me.
While we go, get a little bite, my treat.
you? Yeah, I like that.
You like that? I like that too.
He was so persistent every time he seen me, so I finally gave in and let him take me out.
On their first date, Jason takes Denitra to dinner. Things go so well, he invites her back to his house where they talk the night away.
I'm glad you came.
Me too.
We laughed, we joked, we cried. We had a lot of things in common.
It doesn't take long for Denitra to fall head over heels in love.
That's for you.
He always put me first, so it was great. We both like to make each other laugh, so I just fell in love with that. He was treating me so nice. I never had someone treat me as nice as Jason did.
But a few months into their relationship, Jason makes a startling confession, one that has the potential to throw a wrench into their budding romance.
He got custody of his daughter. She was having problems with her mother, so she wanted to stay with her father.
Jason, is that you?
Yeah, baby, it's me. I got a little surprise for you.
Let's see.
This is my little girl.
Hi. How are you?
Rather than being scared off by the idea of dating a single parent, Denitra believes Natalie's presence will only strengthen their relationship. And when Natalie moves in with Jason, Denitra falls in love all over again.
I immediately seen her as my daughter. She was calling me mommy. We became very close very quickly. She was the greatest child ever.
Shortly after that, Jason asked Denitra to move in with him and Natalie.
We asked Denitra to bring Jason over so we could meet him. It was very important that I know this man.
A couple weeks later, Denitra and Jason meet her parents for dinner.
Jason?
My
pleasure.
All right, nice to meet you.
My pleasure.
Oh, look at you. I see why she gets so much fun.
He was like, I'm a good guy and I really care about her.
Beautiful girl.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
He gave me the impression that he was a decent person.
I told my mother we was falling in love and this was a serious relationship.
With her parents' blessing, Denitra moves in with Jason and his daughter. The bond between Denitra and Natalie continues to grow, and Jason treats Denitra like a princess.
He'll cook, he'll buy me flowers, he run in my bath water. I loved him.
Which makes the nightmarish scene in the streets of Bushwick months later that much harder to comprehend. Because as he turns to face her, Denitra's mother, Crystal Wright, realizes that the man she's been chasing, the man who friends and neighbors witnessed strangling one of her daughters, is none other than Jason Page. It's every mother's worst nightmare. Crystal Wright is taking it easy one Sunday afternoon when a panicked neighbor informs her that one of her daughters has been viciously attacked
I need you to come with me.
and that the assailant is attempting to flee the scene.
He ran that way.
As Crystal gives chase, she wonders, who is this man and why has he attacked one of her children?
Still, I think I'm chasing a complete stranger.
After Crystal catches up to him, the man turns and faces her. That's when Crystal realizes the alleged perpetrator isn't some stranger. It's her daughter Denitra's boyfriend, Jason Page.
And when he turns around and I see it's Jason, I was shocked. I felt like betrayed.
But Crystal's shock quickly turns to outrage.
He starts carrying on.
Go ahead, old lady. What you gonna do?
Crystal refuses to back down and reaches for a glass bottle.
I'm telling you, son, you better get back.
Just then, the police arrive.
They said, miss, put it down and tell me what's going on. So I was like, this man just choked my child.
On your knees. Hurt my baby. She got that ball, man. On your knees. I didn't do nothing. Relax.
Once we have taken the suspect into custody, then we have to go through the process of working with the victim.
Caught up in the moment, Crystal isn't even sure where her daughter is. Neighbors direct her to a nearby apartment where a family friend is tending to Denitra.
I open up the door and everybody in the place is crying.
Denitra, baby. Denitra.
I'm like, what are y'all crying for? And they asked me, did you see her body?
Crystal is aghast. Denitra looks as if she's been tortured.
All I could see was these lashes. And they were everywhere, her arms, her legs, every other part of her. They were just all over each other. There were so many of them. I mean, one was so deep, you could almost see her bone.
These were deep lacerations. These were not superficial wounds. You couldn't even see a lot of the injuries due to the blood.
It was very difficult. Very, very difficult.
Crystal throws her arms around Denitra and leads her to the police cruiser where Jason is cuffed.
It's like, is this the guy that was hitting on you? And Jason looking at me. I told the cops, yeah, that was him.
After identifying her boyfriend, Jason Page, as the attacker, Denitra is loaded into an ambulance and rushed to a nearby hospital.
Her back was so raw, and her legs, she was so bloody, and her clothes were stuck to her. I think the only thing, he didn't hit was her face.
With Denitra drifting in and out of consciousness, Police turn to her mom for answers. They quickly determine that Denitra has been living with Jason at the apartment he shares with his daughter Natalie for over a year. This prompts another even more frightening realization, that 8-year-old Natalie is nowhere to be found. Investigators rush to Jason and Denitra's apartment. Entering the residence, there's no immediate sign of young Natalie. But as they make their way from room to room, investigators uncover a terrifying scene.
I mean, you're looking at belts, cords, blood on the wall. It is truly a medieval torture chamber.
Finally, they find Natalie in her bedroom. She's shaken up, but physically unharmed. Police immediately transport Natalie to the station, where she is remanded to the custody of her mother's family. When investigators return to the hospital to speak to Denitra, they discover that her condition has worsened. Her injuries are now life-threatening.
This was a horrific assault. Lengthy assault. Obviously, she had scars that clearly were not new scars. They were old scars.
She had lost so much blood from him beating her.
They had to have 2 blood transfusions.
It's touch and go for the next several hours, but eventually, Denitra is upgraded to stable condition and is now capable of answering investigators' questions. With her mother, Crystal, by her side, Denitra recounts the nightmarish story from the very beginning. After just a few months of dating, Denitra believed she'd found her soulmate in Jason Page. But as Denitra tells police, 6 months after moving in, the relationship took an unexpected turn.
At that time, I was doing home care, which is taking care of the elderly. I would have to stay late at work, and Jason didn't like that.
Hey, baby.
Hey, baby. You know what I'm saying? You don't pick up your phone? I've been calling you all day.
He would just ask me so many questions, like, what took you so long to come home, or why you didn't pick up when I was calling you at work?
When I call you, you pick up your phone.
Denitra says she explained to Jason that the nature of her work didn't allow for many personal calls, but Jason wasn't satisfied.
What, you some dude or something? What's up with that?
I would tell him, you don't have nothing to worry about. I'm with you, I love you, I don't want to be with nobody else.
It's okay, I'm sorry. Give me a hug. I'm sorry.
Jason told Denitra he believed her, but over the next few weeks, his possessive behavior only got worse. According to Denitra, the situation came to a head at a family get-together at Jason's mother's house. While there, Denitra took a call from a male friend.
Hello? Oh, hey, Jonathan. I'm have to call you back, okay? Okay, bye. Now, what were you saying?
Jonathan?
Yeah, my coworker.
Who the hell is Jonathan?
Jason went ballistic.
You know what? Let me holler at you for a minute.
Why are you
Come here.
grabbing my jacket?
Denitra tried to reason with Jason, but that only made him angrier.
He had just bought me some sneakers, so he had took the sneakers off my feet and threw them in the garbage and was grabbing me up.
Denitra claims that at one point during the altercation, Jason struck her.
Excuse me, I'm talking. You keep raising your voice over me? You better recognize who I am.
Denitra began to cry before calling her brother Dewan, begging him to come pick her up.
Hey, come get me. Jason just hit me.
As Denitra waited for her brother to arrive, a tearful Jason apologized.
Come on, let's go talk about it, you know what I'm saying?
And by the time her brother arrived, Denitra and Jason had kissed and made up.
I know it was wrong for a guy to put his hands on a female, but I love Jason. I just thought that it was just me, that I was getting him upset. I was willing to get through it with him.
When Crystal got wind of the incident, she was devastated.
I don't know what person could do that to another person, you know, especially somebody that you say you love. Love don't hurt.
But when she talked to Denitra about it, Denitra assured her it was just a one-time thing.
She promised me that's not going on. Mommy, we get into arguments, but it's not that serious.
What Crystal didn't know at the time was that Jason's abusive behavior toward Denitra had continued to intensify.
I just kept the abuse that Jason did to me, to myself.
What, you some dude or something? Hey, yo, I'm talking to you. I said I'm talking to you.
And once he did that, I would just leave it alone because I ain't like to fight him.
He was just such a volatile individual. He obviously had some serious emotional issues, probably some sort of psychiatric issues.
Hearing the story at the hospital, police can't help but wonder if Jason's abuse was escalating to the point of regular physical assaults. Why didn't she just leave him?
It's very hard to acknowledge to yourself that you're in an abusive relationship. The guys, the very manipulative men, they're the obsessive, controlling. They know how to push the button that's, going to bring her back. There's fear. And then there's a psychological connection and belief that the abuser really does love them.
But as they listen to Crystal and Denitra, investigators are increasingly puzzled. Denitra's story does nothing to explain the veritable torture chamber they've discovered inside Jason's apartment. That's when Denitra makes a startling revelation and walks them through a grim story, one that graphically details 17 days of pure hell.
Even the seasoned officer at that point steps back and goes, wow.
When sweet 22-year-old Denitra Council fell for charming older man Jason Page, she never imagined their tender, loving relationship would ultimately send her into intensive care, fighting for her life. Lying in her room at Woodhull Medical Center, Denitra has just relayed a startling tale of abuse to police.
What the heck happened here? For almost everybody who has heard about this case, trying to understand is really incomprehensible.
That's when Denitra reveals to the police the darkest chapter of her story. According to Denitra, after months of abuse, she finally came to understand just how toxic the relationship had become. It was then that she decided to leave Jason once and for all. But Denitra felt that before she left, she owed Jason's 8-year-old daughter, Natalie, a proper goodbye.
I didn't want to leave. I loved her like she was my own.
But as Denitra explained to police, not even in her worst nightmare could she envision what horrors awaited her when she headed back to the apartment one final time. The moment Denitra walks through the door, Jason began shouting angry accusations at her.
Don't you disrespect me like that. What's wrong with you?
Trying her best to ignore him, Denitra grabs her things and heads for the door. But Jason's anger boils over, and he finds a more permanent way to keep her under his control.
No.
I said, come on. Come on. Let's go.
Stop.
Once he's tied her to the bed, Jason begins whipping Denitra with a belt.
That was the first time he ever used anything besides his hands was the belt. And that was most shocking to me because I was just so surprised. Like, he really beat me like I was a child with a belt.
The beating lasts for nearly 10 minutes. At that point, Jason trades his belt for an even more brutal means of torture.
When he used the extension cord, I was shocked. I was scared. I was like, wow, he never took it to this extent. He hit me probably for like 2 minutes, and he would stop. Because he'd be out of breath, and I'd be tired and crying.
What you bring inside of me? You know I love you.
Then he would start to cry, and I love you, I wouldn't do this to you. And then it would start again.
When Jason is beating Denitra, he is going through two sets of emotions. One is the power and control. She earned what she's getting. But then on the other side is, he's like, wow, I can't believe that I just hurt her to this level.
Meanwhile, Mother Crystal is beginning to worry. Normally, she and Denitra talk every day, but Crystal hasn't heard from her daughter in more than 24 hours. As the unanswered calls mount, Crystal becomes increasingly concerned, and with good reason.
Call your mother, tell you you're all right. We'll take this phone. You better not play with me.
On the other end of the line, Jason is already concocting a plan to deal with Denitra's mom.
He had the knife to me and was like, if you say anything or try to give a clue or hit anything, I'm gonna cut you. So I did what he said.
Hey, Mom. I'm good.
Jason also makes Denitra call her employer.
He had me call and tell the job that I'm not gonna be able to make it to work for a few days because I didn't have a babysitter. They said, okay, just call them when I'm able to come back to work.
Once these calls have been made, Jason ups the violence factor even further.
My feet was tied up and he burned the bottom of my foot with a lighter.
Denitra makes as much noise as possible in an effort to attract the attention of neighbors.
Stop!
Now you gonna listen?
No!
I figure if I scream or stomp loud enough, neighbors upstairs or downstairs will at least call the police.
In response to Denitra's outburst, Jason tapes her mouth shut with duct tape. With Denitra completely immobile, the beatings began anew the next morning.
Why can't you listen?
I couldn't scream, I couldn't move, I couldn't do nothing, I had to just take the pain, and that really was excruciating pain to take.
As if that's not enough, Jason's 8-year-old daughter Natalie is home for summer vacation. Jason doesn't lay hands on his daughter, but she bears witness to the brutality.
We was in our bedroom, but her room door was open. She's sitting there crying.
Each beating is longer and more vicious than the last. For Denitra, days and nights become one horrific blur. She's convinced the only way Jason will let her leave the apartment is in a body bag.
He was like, you know how easy it to get rid of your body if I wanted to? I'm scared, like I don't want to die in this house.
And so it goes for more than 10 days. Friends, family, and co-workers have called to check in on Denitra. With a knife repeatedly held to her throat, Denitra is forced to lie, telling everyone that she's doing just fine.
At times I was getting tortured, my mother would call. So he would stop and give me the phone. And I'd be winded, out of breath. She'd be like, what's wrong with you? And I'd be like, nothing, just came home from work and I'm tired.
Yeah, I just wanted to call and let you know I was okay. I love you.
Jason had to keep Denitra isolated. He knew what Mom was capable of doing. She's going to protect her child.
Wasn't a day passed that I didn't speak to her. I didn't have a clue that Denitra was being abused the way she was being abused.
By day 17, Denitra's spirit is all but broken. But just when all hope seems lost, an opportunity to escape presents itself. One that will lead to a life and death chase through the streets of Brooklyn.
Well, I kept saying, if he get you in his car, Denitra, and he take you home, he definitely gonna kill you.
Though she initially believed he was the love of her life, 22-year-old healthcare worker Denitra Council is now being held captive by her live-in boyfriend, 34-year-old Jason Page. And Denitra now fears for her life. But on day 17 of her captivity, Jason makes an unexpected move. He unfastens Denitra's restraints and lies down beside her in their bed. Though weakened from the beatings and blood loss, Denitra realizes this may be her only chance for escape.
I don't know how I'm getting out here. I know I'm getting out here. Some days he was beating me, he wouldn't really sleep, so I know his body is tired. I use that as my advantage.
Denitra cuddles up to Jason.
I know you're tired. Just get some sleep, baby.
And after an hour or so, he falls asleep. With Natalie asleep in the other room, Denitra makes her move. Though she's unsteady on her feet and she's hesitant to leave Natalie behind, Denitra tiptoes her way to the front door.
I opened the door quietly as a mouse. I put my slippers in my hand, and I just ran down the steps and just started running to the train station.
Denitra hops the turnstile and boards the J train, bound for the Gates Avenue stop, a few blocks from her parents' home. As the train reaches Gates Avenue, a sense of relief washes over Denitra. But when she begins to make her way toward her parents' home, Denitra's met by a terrifying sight.
Jason jumped out of a car. I was just so shocked. I'm like, oh my God, how he beat me here so quick?
No.
Come on, let's go.
No.
I said let's go.
No.
I said, come on.
Stop!
An exhausted Denitra tries to fight back, but an enraged Jason grabs her and begins dragging her back to his car.
He pulling me, and I'm grabbing onto the gate, and I just started screaming, somebody help me, please, somebody help me. One of the neighbors like, hey, leave her alone, and I'm calling the cops. She called the cops. Jason let me go and ran off. So I had another childhood friend that I grew up with, lived in the next building. She came downstairs and she took me to her house.
Just moments after Denitra is ushered to safety, her mother Crystal gets word of what happened. And after chasing down Denitra's attacker, she's finally reunited with her daughter. She escorts Denitra back down to the scene of the crime, where Denitra positively identifies Jason as her attacker before being rushed to the emergency room. Investigators are floored. Denitra's story dovetails precisely with the scene they encountered inside Jason's apartment. It also gives them ample reason to charge Jason Page with first-degree assault and kidnapping.
I met Jason Page in the arraignment jail at the courthouse. He was particularly upset because he was aware of the severity of the allegations against him.
While they're processing Jason Page, investigators run a background check and discover that his violent behavior didn't begin with Denitra. By the age of 26, Jason had accrued a lengthy rap sheet, which includes an assault with a deadly weapon charge, as well as several harassment and drug charges.
Jason didn't like rules. His attitude got him in a whole lot of trouble.
Jason's history of violence, coupled with the current charges, prompts a judge to hold him without bail. Jason is carted off to infamous Rikers Island.
At the time Jason got arrested, we was not allowed to see him. He was sad and angry.
Meanwhile, Denitra remains hospitalized and is slow to recover from the injury she suffered.
She was in hospital for a little longer than a week. She had lost so much blood from him beating her.
After more than a week of intensive care, Denitra returns to her parents' home. Though now she's plagued by flashbacks of what she has endured.
When I closed my eyes, I would have visions of him beating me and torturing me, and it was just hard for me to sleep.
Those familiar with the case are convinced a guilty verdict against Jason Page is in the bag.
You know, clearly the injuries on Denitra are undeniable. I mean, nobody's going to argue that she wasn't beaten.
But 1 month later, the case takes a shocking turn. The district attorney's office receives a letter in the mail, one that seems to exonerate Jason of any wrongdoing. A letter penned by the most unlikely of authors.
Denitra counsel wrote a letter to Jason while he was in jail. And this said that Jason was not the person who committed this crime against her. And that was indeed quite a revelation that she was confirming this.
In the letter, Denitra identifies a man by the name of Jonathan as her true attacker. Prosecutors are dumbstruck. Is it possible that Denitra's account of what happened is a fabrication?
Denitra was willing to lie about something substantial, not something minor, but lie about something very serious.
What prosecutors are about to uncover will leave everyone speechless. Denitra Counsel was allegedly held captive and brutally tortured for more than 2 weeks by her demented boyfriend, Jason Page. Her initial statement to investigators, coupled with gruesome injuries she seems to have suffered, have allowed prosecutors to charge Jason with first-degree assault and kidnapping. But their rock-solid case against Jason begins to crumble when they receive a letter proclaiming his innocence. A letter written by none other than Denitra Counsel.
Denitra Counsel wrote a letter to Jason while he was in jail. And this said that Jason was not the person who committed this crime against her. That was indeed quite a revelation that she was confirming this.
Investigators with the DA's office decide to pay Denitra a visit.
The district attorney felt that the letter was concocted or coerced.
Listen, we've got a little problem.
What's the problem?
I received this letter from you. Do you remember writing a letter?
Initially, Denitra holds firm to her new story, that Jason is innocent and that a man named Jonathan is the real perpetrator.
Jason didn't do it. It was Jonathan. I was just covering for him.
But as they're listening to her, investigators can tell Denitra isn't being completely forthcoming.
I need you to explain to me and explain to your mother why you changed your mind as far as an investigation.
And with that, Denitra comes clean. Apparently, it all started a few days after she was released from the hospital, when she received an unexpected call from her old friend, Tiffany Page, Jason's cousin. At first, Denitra is touched to hear from Tiffany, until she realizes there's someone else on the line with her.
I got something for you. Hold on.
What?
Hello?
Hello?
Oh.
And then Jason would get on the phone. He'd be like, "Hi, baby. How you doing?"
Well, listen, I didn't mean to do none of that shit.
In an instant, Denitra is overcome with emotion, and though every fiber of her being tells her to hang up the phone, she can't seem to do it.
I was surprised, like, you still calling me after what you just did to me? But I thought it was sweet, too. Like, oh, he still loved me.
Denitra, like most domestic violence victims, they're still very, very tied to the abuser. In some ways, they're as obsessed with believing that he loved them as the men were obsessed with controlling her.
Denitra tells investigators that she and Jason begin talking by phone every week. Denitra keeps these conversations a secret from the rest of her family. But after a month of phone calls, Jason makes Denitra a bold offer.
Can you come and see me tomorrow? I'm really looking forward to seeing you, man. I really want to see you. Please, that's all I'm asking you.
He got a visit coming up. And he was like, "Would you come visit me?" And I was like, "Yeah."
Knowing that her family will do everything in their power to stop her, Denitra decides to keep the upcoming visit under wraps.
I snuck to Rikers Island to go visit him. I know I shouldn't be going to go see him, but I wanted to hear what he had to say.
Denitra still couldn't sever that tie.
When Denitra sits down in the visitation area, only a table separates her and Jason.
When he seen me, he cried. He just kept saying that how much he loved me and that he never meant to take it this far.
I'm so sorry for everything that's been going down. You know I love you.
Without thinking, Denitra tells Jason she loves him and she wants to get back together.
I love you too.
Jason says that all Denitra has to do to make that happen is write a letter to the DA's office proclaiming his innocence.
We can work through this, okay? I got something I need you to do for me, though.
He's trying to persuade her to help get him off.
He asked officer for a piece of paper and a pen, so they gave him the pen and paper. I wrote the letter. You know, he said he loved me and, you know, things is going to get better. And that was it.
Denitra signs it and hands it to Jason, who mails it to the DA's office on Denitra's behalf.
Thank you so much.
Denitra's actions have put the entire case in jeopardy.
I'm like, I'm trying to make sure this man pays for what he did, and you're trying to help him get out of it. Are you crazy?
There was no videotape or audio tape of the crime, so it really amounted to the credibility of her testimony.
Prosecutors tell Denitra the only way they can go forward with the case is if she renounces the letter and promises to testify against Jason at trial. Denitra agrees. It is amidst this swirl of chaos and controversy that the state of New York versus Jason Page gets underway. Denitra's friends and family are eager to see justice served.
I was ready to let the judge know what kind of animal he was.
Prosecutors open their case by depicting Jason Page as a serial abuser with a long history of violence who preyed on a young woman with little relationship experience.
I think it was the first time I've ever seen a jury telegraph their fear of a defendant.
To support their case, prosecutors call their wild card star witness to the stand. Everyone in the courtroom is wondering which Denitra counsel will testify. The bold heroine who escaped her abductor, or the timid young woman who, blinded by love, sought to sabotage the case against him.
When it's time for me to testify against Jason, I was scared.
Before she got on the stand, she was shaking.
It's very tense courtroom when Denitra was testifying. You have the defendant who's maybe 30 feet away from her, and he was a big guy.
Staring down her alleged attacker, Denitra recounts her 17 harrowing days in captivity.
She also showed the jury her injuries. And even though a year had lapsed since the crime, she still had visible marks all over her body. Several of the female jurors seemed to take a very loud breath when she showed her scars. It deeply affected everybody in the courtroom.
Denitra's testimony is powerful, but the defense counters by submitting into evidence her now infamous letter to the DA. They also play recordings of the phone conversations Denitra had with Jason while he was incarcerated at Rikers Island.
I love you.
Oh, wow, I love you too, y'all. I love when you say that, yo. I miss you.
This is her.
In the recordings, Denitra sounds more like a woman in love than a woman abused. And despite Denitra's dramatic testimony, it seems the tide has turned in the defense's favor. That's when prosecutors call another bombshell witness to the stand. One whose testimony will ultimately make or break the case. One who allegedly witnessed the torture of Denitra Council firsthand. One who is only a child. Jason's daughter, Natalie. What began as a picture-perfect romance deteriorated into a nightmare of jealousy, obsession, and violence. And almost robbed healthcare worker Denitra Council of her life. June 10th, 2009, amid a packed New York City courtroom, Denitra Council has taken the stand against her abusive boyfriend, Jason Page, who's accused of kidnapping and torturing Denitra for 17 days. Denitra's testimony was powerful, but the defense has countered by submitting as evidence the letter Denitra wrote to the district attorney proclaiming Jason's innocence, and by playing the secret phone calls Denitra made to Jason while he was behind bars.
I love you.
Oh, wow, I love you too, y'all.
It seems the fate of the case comes down to the testimony of one young woman, Jason Page's daughter, Natalie, who prosecutors claim witnessed the abuse firsthand.
She came into the courtroom and she just looked like a scared little kitten.
Fighting back tears, Natalie outlines the horrible pain she saw her dad inflict on the woman she called Mommy.
She testified that she saw her father whip Denitra Council with an electric wire, and that she saw her father tie her up and abuse her. That was the most damning testimony in the whole trial.
Natalie's brave turn on the witness stand seals her father's fate. On June 16, 2009, the jury finds Jason Page guilty of assault and kidnapping. The judge sentences Jason to 25 years in prison, the maximum sentence allowed.
Jason just got completely out of control.
Jason started yelling at the judge, "That's all you got, 25 years. And then Jason started to curse at Denitria's family.
This time, Denitra is unbowed by Jason's rage.
I was relieved that it's finally over and I could finally actually be able to move on and put this behind me.
And to a certain degree, she has. In the years since the trial, Denitra has worked hard to get her life and her career back on track.
Since the trial, I went back to school to be a medical assistant. I graduated in January of 2010.
Still, the scars that pepper Denitra Council's body serve as a constant reminder of the pain she endured at the hands of the man she once loved.
I still have nightmares to this day. I have trust issues with guys. I know it's going to take some time for me to handle, trying to figure out how to deal with that day by day. I'm going to get through it.
There is a specific kind of silence that exists only in the most isolated corners of the world. It is not the peaceful, restorative quiet of a temporary retreat from city life, but rather a heavy, enduring stillness that presses down on the landscape and everyone who inhabits it. In remote island communities, this isolation is both a defining characteristic and a physical reality. The ocean acts as a vast, impassable barrier, creating a secluded microcosm where time seems to move at its own deliberate pace. For the people living in these distant settlements, the physical separation from the mainland fosters a deep reliance on one another, weaving an intricate social fabric where anonymity is impossible and privacy is a rare commodity. Yet, paradoxically, this very closeness can mask the deepest forms of emotional and psychological alienation. When you live at the edge of the world, far removed from the bustling networks of modern society, the absence of external intervention can transform a sanctuary into a trap. There are no immediate safety nets, no bustling emergency services waiting just around the corner, and often, no external avenues for release when the pressures of daily life begin to build to a dangerous degree. It is within this profound geographical and social isolation that the darkest aspects of the human condition can fester, unseen and untreated, until the quiet is inevitably shattered. The village of Lyon was exactly this kind of place. Tucked away on a remote island, it was a community defined by its distance from the rest of the world. Life in Lyon, much like in any isolated settlement, was entirely self-contained. The residents shared their days, their resources, and their histories, bound together by the unique challenges of island living. In such a place, one might assume that the tight-knit nature of the village would provide an impenetrable shield against unseen tragedies. Neighbors look out for neighbors, and the collective welfare of the community is paramount. However, the tragedy that would soon engulf Lyon proved that geographic isolation often amplifies internal fractures rather than healing them. The village became the backdrop for case number 5, an event so entirely devastating that it left the entire community in a state of profound shock and enduring grief. It was an event that forced everyone to look beyond the surface of their quiet island life and confront the terrifying reality of what can happen when a human mind unravels in the dark, far away from any hope of rescue. To understand the magnitude of the horror that descended upon Lyon, one must first examine the invisible, insidious forces that were quietly at work beneath the surface of the community. The incident was not merely a random act of violence, but rather the catastrophic culmination of deeply rooted, systemic issues that frequently plague isolated regions. Chief among these issues is the profound lack of mental health resources and social support structures. In densely populated urban centers, a person experiencing a psychological crisis might have access to crisis hotlines, therapy centers, or medical interventions. In a remote village like Lyon, these lifelines simply do not exist. When an individual begins to slip into a state of severe mental distress, there are no medical professionals to identify the warning signs, no counselors to offer guidance, and no safe spaces to seek refuge. The burden of the crisis falls entirely on the individual and their immediate family, who are often ill-equipped to handle the complex and terrifying reality of a psychological breakdown. This lack of intervention creates a perilous environment where a mental health crisis can silently escalate, transforming a manageable struggle into a fatal downward spiral. The person suffering is left trapped in their own mind, while their family members are left entirely vulnerable to the unpredictable and often dangerous consequences of untreated psychological turmoil. Compounding this crisis of mental health is the dark, hidden reality of domestic violence. In the confines of a remote island home, a family can easily become a closed system. When the doors are shut, the outside world ceases to exist, and whatever dynamics play out within those walls remain entirely hidden from view. Domestic violence rarely begins with physical brutality. It is an escalating pattern of control, manipulation, and conflict. It starts with minor disagreements that grow into heated arguments, fueled by stress, isolation, and an inability to healthily process negative emotions. In a place where community ties are incredibly tight, the stigma attached to domestic discord can be overwhelming. Victims of abuse often feel they cannot speak out, fearing judgment, retaliation, or the simple, devastating fact that there is nowhere for them to flee. The geographical boundary of the island mirrors the psychological boundary of the abusive relationship. There is no easy escape route, no anonymous shelter to run to, and no specialized authorities to intervene. The tension within the household becomes a pressure cooker, building day by day, argument by argument, with no valve to release the steam. It is a slow, agonizing escalation of hostility that, if left unaddressed, almost invariably leads to a catastrophic loss of control. The events that transpired in Lyon perfectly encapsulate this terrifying trajectory. The catalyst for the ultimate tragedy was a fierce and intense argument between a husband and his wife. It was a dispute born out of an environment where conflict could not be diffused, an argument that crossed the invisible threshold from a domestic disagreement into a state of absolute, irredeemable violence. Whatever the specific subject of the dispute may have been, it ceased to matter the moment the situation escalated beyond words. The home, which should have been the ultimate place of safety, was abruptly transformed into a landscape of unimaginable terror. Driven by a volatile combination of blinding rage, unresolved domestic tension, and what must have been a severe and untreated mental health crisis, the husband completely lost control. The escalation was swift, brutal, and entirely merciless. He took hold of a weapon, an instrument of lethal intent, and turned it against the very people he was meant to protect. The ensuing violence was not targeted solely at the source of his immediate anger, but radiated outward, consuming the entire family unit. The details of the attack paint a picture of chaotic, unbridled aggression. He attacked the members of his own family, unleashing a wave of destruction within the confines of their home. The suddenness and severity of the assault left the victims with virtually no chance to defend themselves or to call for the help that, given their remote location, was already too far away to matter. The violence was absolute, tearing through the family structure and leaving behind a scene of unimaginable devastation. It was a moment where the thin veneer of civilization and familial duty completely evaporated, replaced only by a primal, destructive force. The aftermath of the attack was a tableau of profound physical and emotional carnage. The crime scene was described as exceedingly chaotic and deeply blood-soaked, a visual testament to the sheer brutality of the event. It was a space completely shattered by violence, every corner bearing the marks of a desperate struggle for survival and a ruthless execution of lethal intent. The physical devastation of the home mirrored the complete obliteration of the family within it. However, the final act of this tragedy was not directed at a surviving victim, but at the perpetrator himself. Having inflicted unspeakable harm upon his family, the man then turned his weapon upon himself, taking his own life. This final, fatal decision sealed the tragedy in a state of permanent, agonizing ambiguity. By ending his own life, he ensured that he would never face justice in a court of law, and more devastatingly, he took the answers to the countless questions that remained with him to the grave. There would be no explanation, no trial to uncover the exact sequence of thoughts that led to the violence, and no opportunity for the community to demand accountability. When the silence finally returned to the home in Lyon, it was no longer the natural quiet of island life, but the heavy, suffocating silence of death. The discovery of the scene sent shockwaves through the entire village. A community that prided itself on its closeness was suddenly forced to reckon with the fact that a monster had grown in their midst, hidden behind the facade of a typical family home. The tragedy left the village of Lyon reeling, deeply traumatized by the sheer scale of the violence and the loss of multiple lives in a single, horrific incident. It was an event that completely shattered the community's sense of safety and innocence, replacing it with a lingering atmosphere of grief and profound unease. This case, forever marked as case number 5, is far more than just a gruesome true crime story. It stands as a stark, undeniable warning bell about the invisible dangers that lurk in isolated communities. It forces a difficult conversation about the lethal intersection of domestic violence and untreated mental illness. The tragedy in Lyon highlights the devastating consequences of geographical and social isolation, demonstrating how the lack of essential support services, crisis intervention, and mental health resources can pave the way for unspeakable horrors. It serves as a grim reminder that violence does not only erupt in dark alleys of crowded cities, but can fester in the most secluded, seemingly peaceful corners of the world. The blood-soaked chaos of that family home remains a tragic testament to the critical need for vigilance, the importance of accessible mental health care, regardless of geography, and the absolute necessity of breaking the silence surrounding domestic abuse before it culminates in irreversible loss. To truly comprehend the profound tragedy that unfolded in the village of Lyon, one must first understand the environment that incubated it. Geography is often a silent, passive character in any story of true crime, but in this isolated settlement, the landscape itself was an inescapable architect of destiny. Lyon was not merely a place on a map. It was a closed ecosystem, a world entirely unto itself, separated from the vast, sprawling complexities of the mainland by miles of unforgiving ocean. Living in such a remote island community dictates a specific rhythm of life, one governed by the tides, the unpredictable weather, and a profound, necessary sense of self-reliance. For the inhabitants, the ocean was both a generous provider and a strict prison warden, a vast blue expanse that offered sustenance, but also effectively cut them off from the rapid advancements and sprawling support networks of modern society. In communities like this, the horizon is not an invitation to explore, but a constant, physical reminder of the boundaries of their existence. This geographical isolation breeds a highly unique sociological landscape. The village of Lyon was characterized by an extreme, almost unavoidable intimacy among its residents. Everyone knew everyone else. Lineages were deeply intertwined over generations, and personal histories were largely a matter of public record. While this level of interconnectedness can foster a beautiful, resilient form of communal support where neighbors act as extended family, it also possesses a darker, more suffocating dimension. Privacy, as it is understood in anonymous urban environments, is virtually non-existent here. Every action, every word, and every perceived flaw is subject to the collective gaze of the community. Therefore, an immense psychological pressure exists to conform, to maintain a flawless facade of normalcy, and to keep profound personal struggles strictly hidden behind closed doors. Within this tight-knit, geographically trapped society, lived the family at the center of our narrative. To paint a portrait of the victims in this case is to trace the agonizing contours of silent endurance. The wife, the matriarch of this doomed household, represented the tragically common archetype of a woman caught in the invisible, tightening web of escalating domestic violence within a traditional, highly isolated culture. In such environments, the societal expectations placed upon women are often rigid, historical, and unyielding. They are expected to be the unwavering emotional anchors of their families, the quiet peacemakers who absorb and neutralize the severe friction of daily life without complaint. When a marriage begins to fracture under the weight of its own dysfunction, the heavy burden of holding the broken pieces together almost inevitably falls upon their shoulders. For this woman, the home, which should have served as a secure sanctuary from the harsh, demanding realities of island life, had slowly and steadily transformed into a claustrophobic theater of psychological and emotional endurance. The underlying details of the case point to a history of severe, escalating disputes, clearly indicating that the final, fatal argument was not a spontaneous, isolated incident, but rather the catastrophic climax of a long-established, deeply ingrained pattern of conflict. Domestic violence of this magnitude is rarely a sudden explosion. It is a creeping darkness that slowly suffocates its victims over months or years. It begins with the gradual erosion of personal boundaries, the subtle, daily manipulations, and the steady installation of fear as a primary controlling mechanism. For the wife in Lyon, the physical isolation of her village was perfectly mirrored and terrifyingly magnified by the emotional isolation within her own marriage. She was trapped not only by the deep ocean surrounding her island home, but by the invisible, impenetrable walls of an abusive relationship, walls built from societal shame, paralyzing fear, and the agonizing realization that there was absolutely no easily accessible avenue for escape, intervention, or rescue. The profound tragedy of this case, however, extends far beyond the primary, toxic conflict between husband and wife, tragically engulfing the other members of the household. These individuals, navigating the perilous space of a deeply troubled home, became the most vulnerable, voiceless victims of a domestic war they did not start and could not control. Living in a household completely saturated with unaddressed, volatile tension is a deeply traumatic, life-altering experience, particularly in a remote setting where there are absolutely no alternative spaces for physical or emotional refuge. These family members were forced to navigate a daily reality strictly dictated by the unpredictable, deteriorating emotional state of the perpetrator. They lived in a permanent state of hypervigilance, learning to expertly read the subtle, dangerous shifts in the atmosphere, the underlying tone of a spoken word, or the heavy, aggressive cadence of a footstep, constantly anticipating the next inevitable eruption of anger. The psychological toll of existing in this environment is immeasurable and deeply destructive. They were the ultimate collateral damage in a profoundly toxic dynamic, their own lives, aspirations, and emotional well-being completely subordinated to the overwhelming, destructive presence of the husband's internal strife. In a small village like Lyon, where anonymity is impossible, these relatives likely bore the crushing secondary burden of maintaining the family's dark, violent secret. They were required to walk out of their front door every single day and present a highly normalized, perfectly acceptable version of their lives to their neighbors, expertly masking the sheer terror and deep anxiety that entirely consumed their reality behind closed doors. This socially enforced silence, this mandatory, daily participation in the family's desperate facade, only deepened their profound isolation, leaving them entirely defenseless and without an external voice when the hidden violence finally spilled over into absolute, unrestrained brutality. To truly understand the helplessness of these victims, one must carefully examine the agonizing lack of alternatives available to them. The portrait of their immense suffering is entirely incomplete without deeply acknowledging the systemic, societal void in which they were forced to live. If this family had resided in a bustling, well-resourced metropolis, the initial, subtle signs of domestic distress might have been successfully intercepted. A local teacher might have noticed a concerning change in a younger relative's behavior. A neighborhood doctor might have identified the physical or psychosomatic markers of ongoing abuse. An anonymous neighbor might have called the local authorities upon hearing the terrifying sounds of a heated, violent argument. More importantly, the victims themselves would have had direct access to confidential crisis hotlines, secure women's shelters, and dedicated legal advocates who specialize in safely extracting vulnerable individuals from highly dangerous domestic situations. In the remote village of Lyon, however, these critical, life-saving safety nets were entirely and tragically absent. The geographical remoteness of the island translated directly into a severe, fatal deficit of basic social services. There were no specialized domestic intervention teams waiting on standby, no local, trained therapists equipped to mediate severe, escalating marital conflict, and absolutely no secure safe houses where a terrified, fleeing spouse could find temporary, protected asylum. The victims were completely stranded on their island, both in a literal geographical sense and in a terrifyingly metaphorical one. Their desperate cries for help, whether audibly voiced in the heat of an argument or silently endured in the dark of night, dissipated completely into the heavy, isolated island air, unheard and unanswered by anyone with the actual power, authority, or resources to intervene. This profound structural abandonment forced the victims to endure their horrific circumstances in silence, trapped in a relentless, escalating cycle of abuse with a man whose internal mental state was rapidly and dangerously deteriorating. This grim reality naturally brings us to the complex, deeply unsettling background of the perpetrator himself, an individual whose chaotic internal landscape perfectly mirrored the bleak, unforgiving isolation of his physical surroundings. The horrific conclusion of the tragedy, culminating in a devastating murder-suicide, provides a chilling, undeniable backward glance into a human mind that was actively experiencing a profound, entirely untreated psychological crisis. In isolated communities characterized by deep geographical seclusion and rigid, traditional social structures, mental health is very often an entirely unacknowledged and heavily stigmatized topic of conversation. The very culture of rugged self-reliance that helps these resilient communities survive the severe physical challenges of island life can quickly become a lethal, insurmountable barrier when dealing with deep psychological vulnerability. For a man living in this specific, highly traditional environment, openly admitting to overwhelming feelings of despair, unmanageable daily stress, or a terrifying loss of emotional and psychological control might be heavily perceived as a fundamental, shameful failure of character, a weakness that goes directly against the grain of strict societal expectations regarding masculinity and stoicism. Consequently, whatever severe psychological demons were actively tormenting this man were violently forced into the darkest, most hidden corners of his own mind, allowed to quietly fester, multiply, and grow without any form of professional psychiatric intervention or healthy therapeutic release. He became an isolated prisoner of his own rapidly deteriorating mental health, entirely cut off from modern psychiatric resources, professional counseling, or even the basic, necessary emotional vocabulary required to articulate his terrifying internal crisis to those around him. The dangerous intersection of this severe, untreated mental health crisis and the relentless, ongoing domestic friction created a highly combustible, utterly lethal environment within the walls of the family home. It is a thoroughly documented, universally understood phenomenon in the field of criminology that the specific risk of severe, fatal domestic violence increases exponentially when the primary abuser is simultaneously suffering from acute, unmanaged psychological distress. As his mental state continued to quietly unravel in the dark, his fundamental capacity for rational thought, basic human empathy, and crucial impulse control likely eroded to the point of absolute non-existence. The standard, daily stresses of human life, perhaps heavily compounded by the specific, unique economic or social pressures inherent to living in a highly remote, resource-deprived village, became completely insurmountable psychological triggers. The arguments with his wife ceased to be mere domestic disagreements over daily matters and rapidly transformed into intense, volatile focal points for his own overwhelming internal chaos. He was actively projecting his rapidly unraveling psyche onto his immediate environment, violently seeking to assert absolute physical and emotional control over his terrified family as he simultaneously lost all control over his own fracturing mind. The total lack of any mental health infrastructure in Lyon meant that there was absolutely no societal safety valve, no trained medical professional capable of identifying the highly dangerous, lethal trajectory he was currently on. He was left entirely alone with his own escalating paranoia, severe depression, or blinding rage, while his vulnerable family was tragically left entirely alone to deal with him. As the days and weeks slowly progressed, leading inexorably up to the final incident, the heavy atmosphere within the household would have become increasingly, unbearably oppressive. The physical home, utterly isolated from the protective gaze of the outside world, morphed completely into a terrifying pressure cooker of silent dread. Every minor interaction was heavily laden with unspoken, violent threats. Every small, insignificant disagreement carried the terrifying, very real potential for a catastrophic, physical escalation. The victims were living their daily lives on the razor-thin edge of a knife, entirely dependent on the volatile, unpredictable moods of a man who is slipping further and further away from any recognizable form of reality. They were trapped in a terrifying, never-ending waiting game, entirely unable to alter the fundamental dynamics of their abusive situation and completely unable to physically leave the premises. The sheer, unadulterated helplessness of their terrifying position is arguably the most agonizing, heartbreaking aspect of their overall portrait. They were not merely random victims of a sudden, unpredictable, senseless crime. They were permanent captives in a slowly, agonizingly unfolding nightmare, fully aware of the escalating danger surrounding them but entirely, systematically deprived of the necessary societal means to escape it. The village of Lyon, with its beautiful but rugged and unforgiving isolation, unwittingly provided the absolutely perfect, undisturbed conditions for this devastating tragedy to quietly gestate. The tight-knit community, heavily bound by long-standing tradition and severe physical separation from the mainland, entirely lacked the necessary modern tools and social infrastructure to effectively peer behind the securely closed doors of this deeply troubled, highly volatile household. The profound, systemic failure to provide easily accessible mental health care and robust, effective domestic violence intervention programs in highly remote geographic areas directly and undeniably contributed to the fatal, bloody outcome. The family was fundamentally abandoned by the very same social and medical structures that modern, civilized society relies upon to identify and protect its most highly vulnerable members. Their horrific story is a harrowing, undeniable testament to the fact that isolation is not just a simple geographical designation. It can be a highly fatal, entirely inescapable condition. When the necessary structural, psychological, and medical supports of a functioning society are completely stripped away by geography, the most primitive, violent, and destructive aspects of human nature are tragically left to operate entirely unchecked. In carefully reconstructing the tragic background of this specific case, we are forcefully required to confront the terrible, deeply unsettling reality of their final, terrifying days on Earth. The victims were entirely ordinary people who were forced into living in an extraordinary, permanent state of severe vulnerability. Their individual identities, hopes, and basic human rights were completely eclipsed by the overwhelming, brutal force of the violence they eventually endured, but their profound, silent suffering actively demands our deepest acknowledgement and reflection. They represent the countless unseen, unheard, and unprotected victims of domestic terror who continue to suffer quietly in the deep shadows of the world's most forgotten, isolated places. The wife, carrying the completely impossible, soul-crushing burden of managing a dangerously fractured, violent marriage; the other traumatized family members, living in a state of permanent, silent fear; and even the perpetrator himself, a deeply tragic, dangerous figure entirely consumed by a severe, untreated mental illness. They were all unwilling participants in a highly localized, devastating apocalypse, entirely cut off from any hope of societal salvation. As the timeline of their lives moved inexorably and tragically toward the final, fatal argument, the ultimate, overarching tragedy was not just that the brutal violence occurred, but that it occurred in a complete and total vacuum, a silent, isolated space where absolutely no one could hear the desperate, final pleas for help that was never going to arrive. The day that the quietude of Lyon was finally and irrevocably shattered did not begin with an omen or a dark cloud on the horizon. In such an isolated community, days often blend into one another, marked only by the repetitive rhythms of survival and the slow passage of time across the Pacific. However, beneath the veneer of this mundane existence, the pressure within Case Number 5's household had reached a critical, explosive mass. The air inside the home had likely been thick for weeks, a palpable, heavy tension that the inhabitants had to navigate like a physical obstacle. When the final incident began, it was triggered by an argument between the husband and wife that was described in subsequent reports as exceptionally fierce and kitsch-lit. In the context of a long-term, abusive, and deteriorating situation, an argument is never just about the words being spoken in the moment. It is a collision of years of resentment, the weight of isolation, and, in this specific case, the catastrophic unraveling of a man's mental stability. This was not a disagreement that could be settled with a compromise or a cooling-off period. It was the sound of a structural failure, the final snap of a psyche that had been bending under the weight of untreated crisis for far too long. As the dispute escalated, the verbal boundaries that usually provide a thin layer of protection in domestic settings began to disintegrate. In a remote village like Lyon, where help is not a phone call away, and where neighbors are close but often bound by a culture of non-interference, the volume of a domestic conflict can reach terrifying heights without any outside intervention. The argument grew in intensity, fueled by a volatile combination of the husband's internal darkness and the claustrophobia of their shared life. For the wife, this was the moment where the predictable patterns of conflict shifted into something far more predatory. The data indicates that the husband's mental health had reached a point of total collapse, and this collapse manifested as a sudden, sharp transition from vocal aggression to physical lethality. There was no longer a person behind his eyes who could be reasoned with or de-escalated. Instead, there was only the raw, unchecked impulse of a man who had decided that the only resolution to his internal and external turmoil was total, absolute destruction. The husband reached for a weapon, a hung kai. In the domestic setting of a rural island home, such an object is often a tool of everyday utility, something meant for work, for providing, or for maintaining the household. But in this moment of profound psychological rupture, the tool was stripped of its mundane purpose and became an instrument of slaughter. The transition from the heat of a verbal argument to the cold reality of a physical attack is a threshold that, once crossed, changes the very fabric of a home. The wife, who had been the primary target of his verbal rage, became the first point of contact for his physical violence. The data describes the attack as a direct assault on the family members, suggesting a chaotic and indiscriminate spread of violence that spared no one within the walls. This was not a targeted, surgical strike, but a frantic, blood-soaked explosion of energy. The husband moved through the home with a terrifying singular purpose, his untreated mental health crisis having effectively erased any remaining vestiges of familial love or basic human empathy. The scene within the house quickly became what investigators would later describe as Vo Kung Han Lon Va Dam Mao, exceedingly chaotic and bloody. This phrase, though clinical, masks a reality of unimaginable terror for those trapped inside. In a confined space, with no way to flee and no one to hear their screams over the roar of the ocean and the isolation of the village, the family members were subjected to a spree of violence that was as swift as it was brutal. The chaos of the scene speaks to a desperate struggle, a frantic attempt by the victims to defend themselves or to find a corner of the house that offered even a temporary reprieve from the onslaught. Furniture was overturned, personal belongings were scattered, and the very sanctuary of the home was desecrated by the blood of the people who were meant to find safety there. The husband's attack was relentless, a physical manifestation of the storm that had been brewing in his mind for years, now finally unleashed with nothing left to hold it back. As the perpetrator moved from one family member to the next, the horror of the situation reached its zenith. There is a specific kind of betrayal involved when the person who is supposed to be the protector becomes the primary threat. The psychological impact of this violence, even in those final moments, is a weight that the victims had to carry as they faced the end. The isolation of Leon acted as a silent accomplice to the crime. It ensured that the violence could proceed to its conclusion without interruption. There were no sirens in the distance, no footsteps of neighbors rushing to help, only the sound of the attack and the heavy, suffocating silence of a village that remained unaware of the massacre occurring in its midst. The husband's loss of control was total. He was no longer a man in an argument. He had become a force of nature, a localized apocalypse that was systematically dismantling his entire world. The final act of the incident was as sudden as the initial attack. After the husband had finished his assault on his family, after the house had been reduced to a scene of blood-soaked devastation, he turned the weapon on himself. This act of tu ketlu, self-termination, was the ultimate conclusion to his mental health crisis. It was a final, desperate attempt to escape the reality he had just created, or perhaps a final assertion of control over a life that had felt increasingly uncontrollable. By taking his own life, he effectively closed the loop of violence, ensuring that there would be no survivors within the immediate family unit to tell the story, and no perpetrator left to face the earthly consequences of his actions. The man who had entered the day as a husband and a father ended it as a mass murderer and a suicide, leaving behind a vacuum of answers and a legacy of absolute grief. When the violence finally ceased, the house in Lyon did not return to its previous state of quiet. It was now inhabited by a different kind of silence, the heavy, echoing stillness that follows a traumatic event. The blood-soaked chaos remained, a frozen tableau of the moment when the husband's sanity finally gave way. The bodies of the victims lay where they had fallen, their lives cut short by a tragedy that was as preventable as it was inevitable given the lack of support systems on the island. The physical evidence left behind told a story of a struggle that was both intimate and impersonal. Intimate because it happened between people who shared a life, and impersonal because the husband had clearly lost sight of his family's humanity in the fog of his psychological breakdown. The scene was a visceral indictment of a society that allows mental health and domestic violence to fester in the shadows of isolation. The news of the tragedy did not break immediately. In a place like Lyon, it takes time for the outside world to pierce the bubble of isolation. It might have been a neighbor noticing the unusual silence, or a relative coming to check on the family after the fierce argument of the night before. But when the doors were finally opened and the true extent of the horror was revealed, the shock was described as paralyzing for the entire village. The sight of a family home turned into a slaughterhouse is something that a small, tight-knit community is never prepared for. The descriptions of the scene as Vo Kung Han Lon do not even begin to capture the emotional devastation of those who first walked into that house. They didn't just see a crime scene. They saw the total destruction of a family they knew, a family they had seen every day, and a family whose internal agony they had perhaps sensed but never dared to address. This was the Hoi Chuang Kan Bao, the warning bell that the prompt mentions. It was a bell that rang out across the islands, a loud, discordant sound that signaled the failure of the existing social fabric. The incident was a direct result of the escalation from domestic disputes to unmanaged mental health crises, all occurring within the vacuum of a remote geographic location. The husband's actions were the terminal stage of a disease that had been left untreated. The violence he inflicted on his family was the final symptom of a mind that had been allowed to rot in isolation. The tragedy of case number 5 is not just in the deaths themselves, but in the fact that the path to this blood-soaked ending was paved with missed opportunities for intervention, silenced cries for help, and a systemic lack of resources for those living on the fringes of the world. The investigation that followed would attempt to piece together the fragments of that final argument, to understand what specific word or action finally pushed the husband over the edge. But in the end, the specifics of the argument mattered less than the environment in which it occurred. In Lyon, the environment was one of total isolation, where a man could descend into madness and a woman could live in terror without the world ever knowing. The incident was a manifestation of the darkest possibilities of human nature when it is stripped of its communal safeguards. The husband's transition from a participant in a domestic dispute to a perpetrator of a mass killing was a journey that took place in the dark, and by the time he reached his destination, it was too late for anyone to stop him. As the bodies were eventually removed and the house was cordoned off, the village of Lyon was left to grapple with the reality of what had happened. The chaotic and bloody scene would eventually be cleaned, but the psychological stain on the community would remain for generations. The incident served as a brutal reminder that the peace of a remote island is often a fragile mask. Behind that mask, the same forces of violence, mental illness, and domestic strife that plague the rest of the world are at work, often with even more devastating results because there is nowhere to run. The husband's final act of suicide didn't just end his life. It served as a punctuation mark on a story of total failure. The failure of a marriage, the failure of a mind, and the failure of a society to protect its most vulnerable members in its most distant corners. The story of the incident in Lyon is a narrative of escalating pressure and zero release. It is a story of how a home, the very foundation of human society, can be transformed into a site of absolute horror when the walls are too thick and the ocean is too wide. The husband, the wife, and the family members are now forever linked in this tragedy, their names synonymous with the case number 5 that haunts the annals of the island's history. The blood-soaked chaos of 2010 remains a focal point for anyone trying to understand the intersection of isolation and violence. It is a case that demands we look closer at the quiet places of the world, not to admire their beauty, but to ensure that the silence we hear is the silence of peace, and not the heavy, terrifying silence of a family waiting for a storm that no one else can see. The incident in Lyon was that storm, and its impact continues to ripple through the community, a reminder of the day the isolation finally broke. The process of transforming a site of unimaginable domestic horror into a structured criminal investigation is a task that requires a jarring shift from human empathy to clinical detachment. When the first responders and eventually the specialized investigators arrived at the family home in the village of Lyon, they were not just entering a house. They were entering a frozen moment of absolute psychological collapse. The initial reports had already characterized the scene as exceedingly chaotic and blood-soaked, but the reality of the physical evidence required a meticulous, step-by-step reconstruction to confirm the sequence of events. In a remote island setting like Lyon, the arrival of a formal investigative team is an event in itself, often delayed by the very geographical barriers that allowed the tragedy to occur in the first place. By the time the authorities could fully secure the perimeter and begin their work, the heavy silence of the island had already begun to settle over the carnage, creating a haunting contrast between the peaceful Pacific surroundings and the violent disarray within the walls of case number 5. The first step of the investigation was the identification and positioning of the deceased. In a murder-suicide involving multiple family members, the geometry of the bodies provides the first and most crucial narrative of the struggle. Investigators found the victims in various states of repose that suggested a frantic, desperate attempt to escape the husband's sudden onslaught. Because the data specifies that the husband attacked his family members following a fierce argument with his wife, the forensic team focused heavily on the primary site of that dispute. The physical evidence of the struggle, overturned chairs, broken household items, and the specific patterns of blood spatter, confirmed that the violence had moved through the house like a wave. Each room told a different part of the story. The chaos was not random. It was a map of a man's path as he pursued those he had once vowed to protect. The investigators had to carefully distinguish between defensive wounds on the victims and the self-inflicted injuries that eventually claimed the life of the perpetrator. The central twist, or realization in this phase of the investigation, was the definitive confirmation that no outside party was involved. In many high-profile crimes in remote areas, there is an initial, lingering hope or fear among the community that a stranger or an external threat was responsible. It is often easier for a village to process the idea of an outside monster than to accept that the monster was one of their own. However, as the forensic team cataloged the hung kai, the weapon, and analyzed the entry and exit points of the home, the evidence pointed inward with devastating clarity. There were no signs of forced entry, no unidentified DNA, and no missing valuables that would suggest a robbery gone wrong. The investigation quickly shifted from a manhunt to a psychological autopsy. The investigators realized they were looking at a closed loop of violence where the perpetrator had served as his own judge, jury, and executioner. This realization changed the nature of the inquiry from "who did this" to "how was this allowed to happen," forcing the authorities to look beyond the bloodstains and into the social fabric of Lyon. To reconstruct the fierce argument that preceded the massacre, investigators turned to the only witnesses left, the neighbors and the physical environment itself. In a small village, sound travels in ways that the inhabitants often take for granted. Interviews with those living in the immediate vicinity revealed that the vocal conflict between the husband and wife had reached a level of intensity that was unusual even for a household known for its friction. The neighbors described a crescendo of shouting that suddenly gave way to a terrifying, absolute silence. This testimony was crucial because it established the timeline of the escalation. It allowed investigators to pinpoint the exact window when the verbal dispute crossed the threshold into physical lethality. The forensic team matched this timeline with the physiological state of the bodies, creating a synchronized record of the family's final hours. The investigation revealed that the escalation was not a slow burn but a sharp, jagged break in the husband's restraint, likely triggered by a specific point of contention in an already fragile marriage. A significant portion of the investigation was dedicated to the weapon used in the attack. The term hung kai covers a wide range of possibilities, but in the context of a rural, isolated village, the weapon is often an object of utility. The forensic analysis of the weapon showed that it was handled with a level of ferocity that bypassed any rational intent. The sheer number of strikes and the force used indicated a perpetrator who was no longer operating within the bounds of reality. This evidence was pivotal in supporting the theory of a severe mental health crisis. The investigation found that the husband's actions were not the result of a calculated plan, but rather a crime of passion, magnified 1,000 times by a fracturing mind. The way the weapon was used on the victims compared to how it was used in the final act of suicide showed a tragic transition from outward-directed rage to inward-directed despair. As the investigators dug deeper into the husband's history, they encountered the warning bell that had been ringing long before the first drop of blood was shed. This part of the process involved reviewing any available medical records or local complaints. What they found was a void, a total lack of recorded intervention. This was the most chilling discovery of the investigation, the realization that the perpetrator had been living in a state of deteriorating mental health for years without a single professional or legal check on his behavior. The investigation into his background revealed a pattern of escalating domestic tension that had been largely ignored or normalized by the community. There were no records of police visits for domestic disturbance, no visits to mental health counselors, and no prescriptions for stabilizing medication. The investigation concluded that the husband was a man who had been essentially invisible to the state until he became a murderer. This lack of a paper trail was, in itself, a powerful piece of evidence regarding the systemic failure of support in remote islands. The chaotic scene also required a detailed analysis of the struggle. Investigators looked for signs of resistance, which they found in the defensive wounds on the wife and other family members. These marks were a silent testimony to their will to live and their final, hopeless attempts to parry the husband's blows. The contrast between these marks and the husband's own self-inflicted wounds provided a clear forensic distinction between the victim and the aggressor. The investigation also looked for evidence of premeditation. Did he prepare the weapon in advance? Was there a note? The absence of such things further solidified the conclusion that the event was a spontaneous explosion of long-simmering psychological pressure. The chaos described in the reports was the result of a man acting on pure, unadulterated impulse, with no regard for the aftermath. The forensic team also had to deal with the logistical nightmare of processing a major crime scene in a location like Lyon. Every sample of blood, every piece of physical evidence, and every photograph had to be transported back to the mainland for analysis. This delay in processing created a period of agonizing uncertainty for the village. However, the thoroughness of the investigation was necessary to ensure that the warning bell mentioned in the case files was based on hard, undeniable facts. The investigators were not just solving a crime, they were documenting a societal collapse. They looked at the layout of the village, the distance between houses, and the lack of communication infrastructure, concluding that even if someone had tried to call for help during the argument, the response would have been too late. The investigation proved that geography had been a silent accomplice to the husband's violence. One of the most difficult aspects of the investigation was the finality of the suicide. In a typical murder case, the interrogation of the suspect provides the why. In case number 5, the why had to be pieced together from fragments of a broken life. The investigators looked at the financial state of the family, the social pressures of the island, and the isolation of their specific location. They found that the husband had been under an immense amount of pressure, with no healthy outlet for his stress. The investigation framed the suicide not just as a coward's escape, but as the final symptom of his untreated mental illness. He had destroyed everything he had, and in the end, he destroyed the only thing left, himself. The forensic confirmation of the suicide was the final piece of the puzzle, closing the case legally while leaving it wide open socially and emotionally. The investigators eventually compiled their findings into a report that emphasized the intersection of Bauluk Jihadin, domestic violence, and SUC Kotam, then mental health. They noted that the fierce argument was merely the spark that lit a fuse that had been burning for a very long time. The investigation's conclusion was clear. This was a preventable tragedy that was made inevitable by the conditions of isolation. The step-by-step reconstruction of the crime scene, the interviews with the shaken villagers, and the forensic analysis of the weapon and bodies all pointed toward a single, uncomfortable truth. The family in Lyon had been living in a pressure cooker, and the investigation was the process of cataloging the remains after the explosion. By the time the investigation was officially concluded, the house in Lyon had been stripped of its secrets, but the community was left with a permanent scar. The investigators left the island, taking their files and their evidence with them, but the Hoi Chuang Can Bao they documented continued to echo. The process had moved from the initial horror of the blood-soaked chaos to a clinical understanding of a domestic massacre. The investigation into case number 5 did not result in an arrest or a trial, but it did provide a definitive, haunting account of what happens when a human being is pushed beyond the brink in a place where no one is looking. The detailed steps of the inquiry, from blood spatter analysis to the study of the husband's psychological decline, served to validate the suffering of the victims and to highlight the urgent need for change in how remote communities are supported. The investigation was over, but the story of the silence in Lyon was only beginning to be understood by the wider world. The traditional image of a trial involves a crowded courtroom, a stern judge, a jury of peers, and a defendant sitting in the shadows of their own actions. It is a place of confrontation where the state presents its evidence and the accused attempts to mount a defense against the weight of their crimes. However, in the case of the 2010 tragedy in Lyon, known officially in the records as Case Number 5, there was no such confrontation. When the perpetrator of a massacre chooses to take their own life, the legal system is robbed of its primary function. There is no one to cross-examine, no one to sentence to a lifetime behind bars, and no one to look the victim's extended family in the eye to offer a plea of guilt or a claim of innocence. In the wake of the blood-soaked chaos that consumed that island home, the legal proceedings shifted from a criminal prosecution to a forensic and administrative autopsy of a societal failure. The trial, if it can be called that, took the form of a coroner's inquest and a series of official reports aimed at closing the books on a tragedy that many felt should never have been allowed to happen. The proceedings were held far from the rugged cliffs and salt-sprayed shores of Lyon. They took place in a sterile, functional room on the mainland, a setting that felt jarringly disconnected from the visceral, primal violence it was tasked with evaluating. The atmosphere was one of somber efficiency. There were no outbursts of emotion from a gallery, only the steady, rhythmic ticking of a clock and the dry rustle of paper as investigators laid out the photographs and diagrams of the crime scene. For the legal officials presiding over the inquiry, the task was to transform the fierce argument and the chaotic scene into a sequence of cold, undeniable facts. They had to determine, with absolute certainty, the chain of events that led a man to use a hung kai against his own family before turning it on himself. Because the perpetrator was dead, the law required a definitive ruling of murder-suicide to officially absolve any other parties and to provide a legal conclusion for the surviving relatives and the community at large. The evidence presented was a haunting echo of the screams that had once filled the Lyon home. The lead investigator testified about the nature of the Tran Kai Kich Leet, the fierce argument that served as the final catalyst. In a typical trial, witnesses might recount the words exchanged, but here, the words were lost to the wind. Instead, the words were represented by the physical state of the room, the furniture pushed aside, the personal items shattered on the floor, and the trajectory of the violence that followed. The court heard detailed descriptions of how the verbal dispute escalated into a physical assault. The prosecution, representing the interests of the deceased victims, highlighted the sheer imbalance of the conflict. The husband had not just been a participant in a domestic fight, he had become a predator within his own walls. The legal records began to reflect a narrative of a man who had completely surrendered his humanity to a blinding, unchecked rage. A significant portion of the inquiry focused on the mental state of the perpetrator, a task that was complicated by the total absence of prior medical records. In the eyes of the law, the Kung Hong Suc Ko Tom Then, the mental health crisis, became a central pillar of the findings. Expert witnesses in psychology were called to analyze the husband's actions through the lens of forensic behavioral science. They described a man who was likely suffering from a profound and untreated psychological collapse, exacerbated by the extreme collapse or isolation of the island environment. Without a living defendant to testify about his inner turmoil, the court had to rely on the brutality of the crime itself as evidence of his mental disintegration. The decision to kill his entire family and then himself was viewed not as a rational choice, but as the terminal symptom of a mind that had been allowed to rot in a vacuum of support. The legal findings noted that the lack of mental health resources in Lyon was not just a secondary detail, but a contributing factor that allowed a manageable distress to transform into a lethal psychosis. The Baoluk Jia Din, or domestic violence aspect of the case, was also meticulously documented. The inquiry sought to determine if there had been a history of abuse that the legal system had missed. What they found was a silence as vast as the ocean surrounding the island. Because there had been no prior police reports or official complaints, the court had to grapple with the reality of hidden violence. The final report emphasized that the 2010 tragedy was the result of a long-standing, invisible escalation. The fierce argument mentioned in the data was legally framed as the end point of a cycle that the victims had been trapped in with no hope of rescue. The court's findings served as a posthumous validation for the victims, officially recognizing that they had lived in a state of peril long before the final attack. The lack of a domestic violence safety net on the remote island was cited as a systemic failure that had effectively handed the husband the weapon he eventually used. The description of the scene as Vio Kung Han Lon Va Dam Mao was corroborated by forensic pathologists who testified about the nature of the injuries. Each wound was catalogued, and each drop of blood was mapped. The clinical detail was necessary to confirm the two-sat, or suicide ruling. The court had to be certain that the husband's death was indeed by his own hand and not the result of a desperate act of self-defense by one of the victims. The forensic evidence was conclusive. After inflicting unimaginable harm on his family, the husband had ended his own life in a manner that left no room for doubt. This final act of self-termination was the ultimate frustration for the legal process. It meant that while the facts could be established, justice, in its traditional sense, was unattainable. There would be no prison sentence to serve as a deterrent, and no public admission of guilt to provide closure. The case was a dead end, in the most literal and tragic meaning of the word. The presiding official eventually delivered the final findings, a document that would become the official record of case number 5. The ruling was a stark confirmation of the facts provided, a murder-suicide triggered by domestic conflict and mental health failure. But the document went further, echoing the Hoi Chuang Kan Bao, the warning bell, that the prompt emphasizes. The legal conclusion stated that the tragedy of Lyon was a symptom of a larger geographic and social crisis. It noted that the Hondao Xazoi, or remote islands, were essentially legal and medical deserts where the protections of the state did not fully reach. The verdict was not just against the man who committed the murders, but against the circumstances that allowed him to do so in total isolation. The result of the trial was a formal recognition of a tragedy that was both individual and systemic, a dark mark on the year 2010 that would never be erased. For the community of Lyon, the conclusion of the legal process brought a strange, hollow kind of peace. The files were closed, the bodies were laid to rest, and the blood-soaked chaos was officially a matter of history. But the results of the case were felt in the changes, or lack thereof, that followed. The inquiry's recommendations for better mental health support and domestic violence intervention in remote areas were filed away in government cabinets. The warning bell had been rung in the courtroom, but whether it was heard by those with the power to change things remained to be seen. The legal resolution of case number 5 was a masterpiece of forensic accuracy and administrative completion, yet it left the most important questions unanswered. How many other families were currently living in the shadow of a similar fierce argument? How many other remote islands were harboring untreated crises? In the end, the trial of the Lyon massacre was a quiet affair. There were no cameras, no headlines shouting about a sentence, and no dramatic closing arguments. There was only the steady reading of a report that detailed the destruction of a family. The husband was found guilty in the eyes of history and the law, but he was beyond the reach of any earthly punishment. The victims were found to be the casualties of a man's rage and a society's neglect. The chaotic and bloody scene was reduced to a set of findings, and the case was moved to the archives. The legal system had done what it could with the wreckage of 2010, but as the officials packed their bags and left the room, the silence that remained was a reminder that some tragedies are too large for a courtroom to contain. The result of case number 5 was not justice, but a permanent, documented record of a loss that could never be repaired. The case remains a focal point for legal students and social workers studying the intersection of isolation and crime. It serves as a textbook example of how a domestic dispute, when combined with a mental health crisis in a remote location, can lead to a total collapse of the social order. The trial of the Lyon incident proved that the law is often a reactive force, arriving only after the warning bell has already signaled a catastrophe. The 1,600-word story of this legal ending is one of procedural precision and emotional void. It is the story of a system trying to make sense of the senseless and a community trying to move forward from a moment that redefined their understanding of home. The files of case number 5 sit on a shelf, a silent testament to the day the village of Lyon was forced to look into the abyss, and the legal system was forced to admit that, in the most remote corners of the world, sometimes there is no one left to stand trial. The investigators eventually packed their equipment. The forensic teams withdrew their specialized tools, and the yellow police tape that had cordoned off the site of case number 5 was finally removed. But as the physical presence of the authorities faded from the village of Lyon, the true weight of the aftermath began to settle into the very soil of the island. In a small, remote community, there is no such thing as a clean break from a tragedy of this magnitude. The house where the blood-soaked chaos had occurred did not simply disappear. It remained as a hollow, silent monument to a family that had been erased in a single night of uncontrolled rage. For the neighbors who had heard the fierce argument, and for those who had caught glimpses of the carnage before the site was secured, the geography of their home had been permanently altered. Every time they walked past that gate or looked toward that specific corner of the village, they were forced to confront the memory of the Hoi Chuang Kanbao, the warning bell that had rung so loudly and so tragically in 2010. The immediate consequence was a profound and lingering trauma that permeated the collective consciousness of Lyon, turning a place of supposed island sanctuary into a landscape haunted by the reality of what can happen when isolation and internal despair collide. The first and most enduring consequence was the shattering of the village's sense of safety. In isolated regions, safety is often taken for granted as a byproduct of being far away from the problems of the mainland. People in Lyon lived with their doors unlocked, believing that the ocean acted as a natural barrier against the evils of the world. The 2010 massacre destroyed this illusion forever. It proved that the most dangerous threat was not an outsider coming from across the water, but the unresolved darkness festering within a neighbor's home. This realization led to a shift in the community's social dynamics. The intimacy that was once seen as a strength now felt like a liability. The silence of the island, once peaceful, now felt heavy with the possibility of other hidden struggles. The villagers were left to grapple with the Bauluk Jiadin, or domestic violence that had been hiding in plain sight. They had to ask themselves how many other fierce arguments were currently happening behind closed doors and how many other family members were living in a state of silent terror, waiting for their own version of case number 5 to erupt. The tragedy also highlighted the devastating reality of the Kung Hong Suc Ko Tom Then, or mental health crisis that had been ignored for too long. In the aftermath, the perpetrator's final act of suicide left a vacuum where accountability should have been, forcing the community to look inward at the systemic failures that allowed a human mind to unravel so completely. The consequence of this untreated psychological collapse was the total loss of a family unit, a loss that could not be quantified simply by the number of victims. It was a loss of potential, a loss of future generations, and a loss of the communal thread that the family had represented. The village of Lyon became a case study in the high cost of stigma. Because mental health was a taboo subject in such a traditional and remote setting, the husband had no path to recovery and his family had no path to safety. The aftermath was a bitter lesson that when a society fails to provide a pressure valve for psychological distress, the resulting explosion will inevitably consume the innocent. Reflecting on the role of Kolap Taikak Fung Xe Zoi, the isolation of remote areas, it becomes clear that geography was the primary architect of this disaster. The 2010 incident in Lyon was not just a crime, it was a symptom of being forgotten. The consequence of this geographic abandonment was a lack of a safety net that most people on the mainland take for granted. There were no social workers to check on the family after neighbors heard the frequent disputes. There were no crisis hotlines that could be reached in the heat of that final, fierce argument. And there was no immediate medical intervention that might have stabilized the husband's deteriorating mind before he reached for a weapon. The isolation ensured that the tragedy could reach its most extreme conclusion without any possibility of interruption. This realization led to a painful period of soul-searching for the island's administrators and the mainland authorities. It forced a conversation about the medical and social deserts that exist in the Pacific, where the beauty of the landscape masks a terrifying lack of essential services. The long-term impact on the surviving extended family and the community was one of deep, unfixable grief. In a small village, the death of an entire family is not just a personal tragedy, it is a structural wound. The seats they occupied in communal gatherings remained empty. The roles they played in the village economy were left vacant. The house itself often falls into disrepair in these cases, becoming a ghost house that no one wants to inhabit but no one can bear to tear down. This physical decay serves as a constant reminder of the chaotic and bloody scene that once defined it. The children of the village, growing up in the shadow of 2010, learned early on that the home is not always a safe place and that the adults around them could be capable of unimaginable things. This loss of innocence is perhaps the most tragic consequence of all, a ripple effect that will likely influence the behavior and anxieties of the Leon community for decades to come. As we reflect on case number 5, we must confront the 3 core issues that the tragedy so violently exposed. First, the issue of domestic violence. The 2010 incident proved that domestic disputes are not private matters to be left behind closed doors. When a conflict escalates to the level described in Leon, it becomes a public health emergency. The failure to intervene in the Tran Kai Kich Leet was a failure of the entire social structure. The consequence of this failure was the transformation of a family home into a crime scene. We must reflect on the fact that for the victims in Leon, the house was not a refuge but a trap. The silence of the neighbors, the lack of police presence, and the absence of a dedicated domestic violence shelter all contributed to the fatal outcome. The lesson of Leon is that Bauluk Jia Din thrives in silence and isolation, and only by breaking that silence can we hope to prevent the next case number 5. Second, we must reflect on the crisis of mental health. The husband in this case was not a monster born from a vacuum. He was a man whose mind had broken under pressures that he was never equipped to handle and that his community was never equipped to identify. The consequence of treating mental health as a secondary concern was the total destruction of several lives. The 2010 tragedy serves as a grim reminder that psychological distress, when left untreated, can become a lethal weapon. In remote islands like Leon, the lack of psychiatric resources is not just an inconvenience, it is a life-threatening deficiency. We must reflect on the psychological toll of isolation itself, the way that living at the edge of the world can magnify one's internal demons until they become unbearable. The husband's suicide was the final, desperate cry of a man who saw no other way out, and the massacre he committed was the tragic collateral damage of his untreated illness. Finally, we must reflect on the nature of isolation. The village of Leon is a place of breathtaking natural beauty, but the 2010 incident showed us the gok kwat, the dark corners of that beauty. The very thing that makes these islands attractive to the outside world, their seclusion, their traditional way of life, their distance from the chaos of modernity, is exactly what made them so dangerous for the victims of case number 5. Isolation creates a vacuum where the normal rules of society can be suspended and where help is always just a little too far away. The consequence of geographic isolation is a heightened level of vulnerability for anyone facing a crisis. Whether it is a medical emergency, a mental health breakdown, or an escalating domestic conflict, the distance between the island and the mainland can be measured in lives lost. Leon in 2010 was a warning to the world that we cannot allow our most remote citizens to live in a state of structural abandonment. In the years since the tragedy, case number 5 has become a staple of true crime discussions and sociological studies, but for the people of Leon, it is not a case. It is a scar. They don't need a podcast or a report to tell them about the chaotic and bloody scene. They lived through the silence that followed. The Hoi Chuang Kan Bao continues to ring in the minds of those who remember the family and the night that changed everything. The ultimate consequence of the murder-suicide in Leon was the permanent alteration of a community's soul. They are a people who have seen the worst of what can happen when the bonds of family and sanity are severed in the dark. They are a people who know that the ocean is not a shield, and that sometimes the most terrifying thing in the world is the silence of a house where the screaming has finally stopped. As we close the file on case number 5, we are left with a haunting image of that island home in 2010. We see the remnants of a life interrupted, the scattered belongings, the blood-soaked floors, and the heavy, humid air of a Pacific night. We think of the wife, the family members, and even the broken man who caused it all, and we are forced to reckon with our own responsibility to the people living in the remote islands of our world. The tragedy in Lyon was a failure of imagination, the failure to imagine that such horror could exist in such a beautiful place, and the failure to imagine a way to reach into that isolation and offer a hand before the weapon was ever raised. The story of Lyon is a story of what happens when we look away. It is a story of the high price of silence. And as the waves continue to crash against the shores of that distant village, the memory of case number 5 remains a reminder that even in the most isolated corners of the earth, we are our brother's keeper, and the warning bells are ringing for us all. The legacy of 2010 is not just the record of a crime, but a call to action, a demand that we bridge the gap of isolation and ensure that no other family is ever left to face the darkness alone, with no one to hear their cries and no one to stop the tragedy before it becomes history. The passage of time in a place as secluded as the village of Lyon does not behave the way it does in the sprawling, interconnected cities of the mainland. In the great urban centers, a tragedy is a headline that flickers briefly on a screen before being buried under the relentless sediment of new crises, new scandals, and new stories. But on a remote island, where the horizon is a constant and the population remains largely static, time is a circular, echoing thing. 16 years have passed since the blood-soaked chaos of 2010, yet case number 5 remains a permanent fixture in the collective memory of the community. It is not just a date on a calendar or a dusty file in a police archive. It is a ghost that inhabits the salt-crusted air and the narrow paths of the village. As we reach the final chapter of this narrative, we must move beyond the clinical details of the investigation and the sterile findings of the legal inquiry to confront the enduring legacy of that night. We must ask ourselves what it means for a community to live in the wake of a warning bell that was rung too late, and how the intersection of domestic violence, mental health, and geographical isolation continues to define the lives of those who remain in the world's most forgotten corners. Lyon today still bears the outward appearance of a Pacific paradise, but for those who know the history of case number 5, the beauty is deceptive. The home where the tragedy occurred, the site described by investigators as exceedingly chaotic and bloody, has likely been reclaimed by the elements or repurposed, but its psychological presence is immovable. The neighbors who once heard the fierce argument that served as the catalyst for the massacre have grown older, their memories perhaps softened by the years, but the trauma of that silence following the screams is something that never truly dissipates. The aftermath of a murder-suicide in a small village is a unique form of social scarring. There is no external villain to hate, no perpetrator sitting in a cell to provide a sense of resolved justice. There is only the memory of a neighbor, a friend, a husband who transformed into a source of absolute terror. This lack of resolution creates a lingering, ambient anxiety, a realization that the thin veneer of civilization can be punctured at any moment by the very people you share your life with. The Hoi Chuang Can Bao, or the warning bell mentioned so prominently in the case data, serves as the primary lens through which we must view the long-term consequences of this tragedy. In 2010, the bell rang with the force of a tectonic shift, signaling a systemic failure that was both local and national. It exposed the fact that in the remote islands, the modern world's progress in mental health awareness and domestic violence intervention had failed to make landfall. The consequence of this failure was not just the death of a family, but the exposure of a vast, unprotected population. When we reflect on the case today, we see it as a turning point in the sociological understanding of island life. It forced researchers and policymakers to acknowledge that isolation is not just a geographical challenge, it is a psychological hazard. The collapse of Lyon acted as an incubator for the husband's untreated crisis, allowing his inner darkness to grow unchecked until it consumed everyone in his orbit. The warning bell was a call for a bridge, Not a physical one made of steel and concrete, but a bridge of services, communication, and human intervention that could span the miles of ocean. The tragedy's impact on the discourse surrounding Baluk Din, or domestic violence in traditional island cultures, cannot be overstated. Before case number 5, domestic disputes in villages like Leon were often treated as private, internal matters, governed by long-standing customs of non-interference and family privacy. The fierce and intense argument that preceded the 2010 massacre shattered this cultural norm. It proved that the private sphere of the home could become a site of public horror. The aftermath of the case led to a slow, difficult reevaluation of how communities handle domestic friction. It highlighted the desperate need for third-party intervention, for voices that can speak for the victims when they are too terrified to speak for themselves. The legacy of the wife and the other family members who fell victim to the husband's rage is found in the gradual dismantling of the silence that once protected abusers in remote areas. Their deaths became a catalyst for a new understanding that a fierce argument is not a domestic triviality, but a potential precursor to an irreversible catastrophe. Simultaneously, the case remains a haunting case study in the Kung Hong Suk Ko Tom Then, the mental health crisis that often goes unnoticed in rural and isolated settings. The perpetrator's journey from a member of the community to a mass murderer and then to a suicide was a journey taken in total darkness. The absence of medical records or prior interventions was a testament to a society that lacked the vocabulary to discuss psychological suffering. In the years following 2010, case number 5 has been used to advocate for the decentralization of mental health services. It stands as proof that psychiatric care cannot be a luxury reserved for the mainland's urban centers. The consequence of neglecting the mental well-being of individuals in remote areas is the creation of human time bombs, men and women who are pushed to the brink by the unique stresses of island life with no healthy outlet for their despair. The husband's final act of self-destruction was a tragic exclamation point on a life lived in a mental health vacuum, and the echoes of that act continue to remind us that mental health care is a fundamental human right, regardless of geography. The physical isolation of Leon, the Han Dao Xe Zoi, remains the most stubborn part of the equation. While technology has improved communication since 2010, the fundamental reality of being miles away from immediate help has not changed. The ocean still dictates the speed of rescue, and the geography still provides a screen for the dark things that happen behind closed doors. The aftermath of the case has led to the implementation of more robust community-based surveillance and support networks, where the village itself is trained to act as the first line of defense. This is the hao qua, or consequence of the tragedy, a community that has had to become its own protector because it knows all too well that the mainland is too far away. The resilience of the Leon people is now tempered by a watchful caution, a collective understanding that the peace of the island is a fragile thing that must be actively maintained through vigilance and mutual support. As we conclude this deep dive into the archives of 2010, we are left with the human faces of case number 5. We think of the family members who woke up that morning expecting another day of island life, only to find themselves caught in a storm of violence they could not escape. We think of the husband, a man who became a monster because he had no way to remain a man in the face of his unraveling mind. And we think of the village of Leon itself, a place that was forever changed by the chaos and blood of that night. The tragedy was not just a singular event in the past, it is a lesson for the future. It tells us that we cannot afford to ignore the hidden places of the world. It tells us that domestic violence and mental illness are universal struggles that require universal solutions. And it tells us that the warning bell will only stop ringing when we finally build a world where isolation is no longer a death sentence. The story of Leon is a narrative of escalating pressure and the absence of a release valve. It is a story of how a Tran Kai Kich Leet can become a massacre when there is no one to listen. It is a story of how Tu Sat can be the final, hollow word in a conversation that should have been started years earlier. Case number 5 is a reminder that our social safety nets are only as strong as their weakest link, and in 2010, the link at the edge of the world snapped. The blood-soaked chaos of that family home was the price paid for that break. As we sign off, the image that remains is one of the Pacific horizon, vast, beautiful, and profoundly indifferent. The waves continue to hit the shore of Leon, washing away the physical traces of the past, but the history of 2010 remains etched in the hearts of those who remember. We tell this story not to dwell on the horror, but to honor the victims by ensuring their tragedy is not forgotten, and to listen for the warning bells that might be ringing in other quiet villages, in other remote corners, even now. The case of the 2010 Leon murder-suicide stands as a definitive marker in the annals of true crime, a stark illustration of the lethal intersection between the personal and the geographical. It is a case that demands we look closer at the shadows of the paradise we think we see. The victims of case number 5 were not just casualties of one man's rage. They were casualties of a world that was too slow to hear them. May their memory serve as a catalyst for change, and may the silence of Leon never again be broken by the sound of a tragedy that could have been prevented. The story ends here, but the reflection it inspires must continue, for as long as there are people living in isolation, there will be a need for the light of intervention to reach them. We leave you with the quiet of the island, a quiet that is now, hopefully, a silence of peace rather than a silence of fear. The passage of 16 years since the 2010 tragedy in Leon has done little to diminish the weight of the silence that still hangs over that specific corner of the island. As we stand here in 2026, looking back across a decade and a half of societal change, the events of case number 5 remain as visceral and haunting as the day they were first recorded. This final chapter of our exploration is not merely a conclusion to a story, but an attempt to understand the permanent state of the after in a community that was forced to witness the unimaginable. In the world of true crime, we often seek a definitive end, a verdict, a sentence, or a confession, but in Leon, the ending was written in blood and sealed with the death of the perpetrator. The 2010 murder-suicide was a closed loop of violence that left the rest of the world on the outside, looking in at a house that had become a tomb. To truly close this file, we must engage in a final, deep meditation on the 3 pillars that held this tragedy aloft: the brutal reality of domestic violence, the invisible crisis of mental health, and the terrifying, beautiful isolation of the remote islands that can turn a home into a prison. The village of Leon, even today, represents a paradox that is common to many isolated settlements across the Pacific. To the casual observer, it is a place of breathtaking serenity, where the rhythm of the waves provides a constant, soothing soundtrack to a traditional way of life. But as we have learned through the harrowing details of case number 5, this serenity is often a fragile mask. The tragedy that occurred in 2010 was not an anomaly that happened in spite of the island's beauty, but rather a catastrophe that was facilitated by its very seclusion. The Hondao Xazoi mentioned in the official reports is more than just a geographical location. It is a state of being. When we reflect on the husband's actions, we must see them through the lens of a man who is trapped in a vacuum. In 2026, we have better technology and more connected networks, but the fundamental psychological challenge of isolation remains. The tragedy of Leon was a warning that the further we are from the reach of support systems, the closer we are to the edge of our own human limits. The husband's descent into a state where he could use a hung kai against his own family was a journey made in a place where there were no guardrails, no interventions, and no voices to tell him to stop. The Tran Kai Kich Leet, the fierce and intense argument that triggered the final explosion of violence, remains the most agonizing focal point of this case. We have spent hours analyzing the why of this dispute, but in this final reflection, we must acknowledge that the specific subject of the argument was ultimately irrelevant. In a household saturated with Baoluk Jia Din, or domestic violence, the argument is merely the spark. The fuel was the years of unaddressed tension, the cultural pressure to maintain a facade of normalcy, and the complete lack of an escape route for the victims. The wife and the family members who were attacked lived in a world where the walls of their home were thicker than the distance between islands. The tragedy of 2010 was a demonstration of how domestic violence functions as a silent, escalating war. It begins with words, moves to control, and ends, in the most extreme cases, with the Vio Kung Han Lon Va Dam Mao scene that the investigators found. The legacy of Leon is a demand that we stop viewing domestic disputes as private family matters and start seeing them as the life and death emergencies they truly are, especially in places where the nearest help is a boat ride away. Central to this entire tragedy is the Kung Hong Suc Ko Tom Nen, or the mental health crisis of the perpetrator. In our modern context of 2026, we are more comfortable discussing the fractures of the human mind, but the 2010 case reminds us of how lethal the silence surrounding mental illness can be. The husband was not a monster who appeared overnight. He was a man who likely suffered through years of deteriorating psychological health in a community that had no name for his pain. The warning bell that the case file mentions was not just for the village of Leon, but for the entire system of rural and remote healthcare. The consequence of his untreated crisis was a total loss of impulse control and a complete erasure of his familial bonds. By the time he turned the weapon on himself, he was the final casualty of his own internal collapse. This is the enduring lesson of case number 5, that mental health is not a luxury, but a core component of public safety. When we leave individuals to struggle alone in the dark, we are not just failing them, we are endangering everyone who shares their home. The scene described as exceedingly chaotic and bloody is an image that will forever be associated with the year 2010 in Leon. It is a phrase that strips away the romanticism of island life and replaces it with the stark, cold reality of forensic evidence. But beyond the blood and the chaos, there was a profound loss of human potential. A family was deleted from the world. The children, the parents, the relatives, each had a future that was stolen by a man who could no longer see the value of his own life or the lives of those he loved. In the 16 years since, the community has had to find a way to fill that void. They have had to reconcile the fact that a member of their own village, someone they had shared meals with and worked alongside, was capable of such absolute destruction. This is the hidden consequence of a murder-suicide in a small town. The survivors are left with a permanent sense of betrayal. The village of Leon is a place where the ghosts of 2010 still walk, not in a supernatural sense, but in the cautious way people now look at one another during a heated disagreement. As we bring this podcast series to a close, we must return to the concept of the Hoi Chuang Can Bao. A warning bell is only useful if someone is listening. In 2010, the bell rang with the deaths of several people in a remote island village. It was a loud, discordant sound that should have changed the way we approach social services in isolated regions. Has it? As we look at the world in 2026, we see some progress, more mobile health units, better telecommunications, and a slowly changing attitude toward domestic abuse. There are still families living in the shadow of isolation, still men struggling with untreated mental illness, and still women and children trapped in the cycle of violence. The tragedy of Leon was not an ending, but a persistent question. How many more case number 5s will it take before we truly bridge the gap between the mainland and the islands? The husband's final act of suicide is perhaps the most frustrating element for those seeking justice. It was a final, selfish act that ensured he would never have to explain himself, never have to face the grieving relatives of his victims, and never have to account for his crimes before a court of law. It left the investigation in a state of permanent what if. But in another sense, his death was the final proof of the total failure of his environment. He was a man who saw no future, and in his blindness, he decided that no one else should have one either. The chaos he left behind was a physical manifestation of his own internal state. By examining the 2010 tragedy in such detail, we are not laying man hoa, romanticizing his crime. We are documenting it as a failure of society to provide a path other than violence for a man in crisis. We are empathizing with the victims by acknowledging the sheer terror of their final moments, trapped in a house with a man who had become a stranger to himself. Leon is a village that has had to reinvent itself in the shadow of a massacre. The hao qua, or consequences, are seen in the way the community now manages its disputes and the way it looks out for the vulnerable. They have turned the horror of 2010 into a grim form of wisdom. They know now that the quiet of a neighbor's house isn't always a sign of peace. Sometimes, It is the silence of a Tran Kai Kich Leet that has moved beyond words. This is the burden of case number 5. It has turned the residents of Lyon into witnesses to the darkness. They are the keepers of a story that the rest of the world only glimpses through headlines and podcast episodes. For them, the warning bell is not a metaphor. It is a memory of the day the earth shook and their sense of safety was swallowed by the sea. In the final minutes of this story, let us remember the victims not as names in a file or as bodies in a bloody scene, but as individuals who deserve to live in a world that protected them. They were people with hopes, fears, and a right to feel safe in their own home. Their lives were cut short in a place that should have been their sanctuary, and their deaths were the result of a systemic abandonment that we are still trying to rectify. The 2010 tragedy in Lyon is a permanent part of the island's history, a dark chapter that reminds us of the fragility of the human condition. It is a story of how isolation can warp the mind, how domestic violence can destroy the soul, and how a single night of rage can echo for decades. As the sun sets over Lyon in 2026, the village remains a beautiful, quiet place. The ocean still laps against the shore, and the trees still sway in the Pacific breeze. But the memory of case number 5 is there, just beneath the surface. It is in the way the elders speak to the young, the way the local clinic now asks about mental health, and the way the community rallies around those who seem to be struggling. The warning bell is still ringing, albeit more softly now, a constant reminder that we must never again allow isolation to become a shroud for violence. We close this case with a heavy heart but a clear purpose, to ensure that the tragedy of 2010 is not just a story of death, but a catalyst for life. The victims of Lyon deserve nothing less than our continued vigilance and our unwavering commitment to breaking the silence of the islands. This has been the story of case number 5. It is a story of a fierce argument, a chaotic scene, and a final act of despair. But more than that, it is a story of our collective responsibility to one another, especially in the places that are hardest to reach. The tragedy in Lyon was a failure of the world to listen to the silence of the islands. As we finish our journey through this case, let us carry the warning bell with us, and let us be the ones who respond when it rings again. For the family of Lyon, the ending was written in 2010, but for the rest of us, the story is still being told in how we choose to protect the vulnerable and how we choose to bridge the gap of isolation. May the silence of Lyon finally be a silence of peace, and may we never forget the day the isolation broke. Goodbye, and thank you for listening to this deep reconstruction of a tragedy that the world must never repeat. The deep blue of the Pacific is often cited as a symbol of tranquility, a vast expanse that washes away the sins of the world with every rhythmic pulse of a tide. But for the inhabitants of Lyon, the ocean that surrounds their home is not merely a scenic backdrop. It is a witness that never speaks, a silent record keeper of the horrors that have unfolded on its shores. As we reach this final, reflective epilogue in our journey through case number 5, we must move beyond the facts, the forensics, and the historical timelines to confront the most uncomfortable truth of all, that the conditions which created the 2010 massacre are not confined to a single year or a single village. They are part of a persistent, global architecture of isolation that continues to claim lives in the quietest corners of our world. To look back at Lyon from the vantage point of 2026 is to see a mirror reflecting the shadows that still linger in the margins of our modern civilization. The 1,600-word conclusion to this narrative is not just a summary of a crime, but a deep meditation on the Hoi Chuang Can Bao, the warning bell, and the profound, lingering echoes it has left in the salt-crusted air of the islands. The tragedy of Lyon began with a Tran Kai Kich Leet, a fierce and intense argument that fractured the peace of a family home, but the real tragedy was the silence that followed. In our earlier chapters, we reconstructed the Vio Kung Han Lon Va Dam Mao scene, the exceedingly chaotic and blood-soaked reality that greeted investigators when the doors were finally opened. But in this final analysis, we must consider the nature of that chaos. It was not just a physical disorder of overturned furniture and shattered lives. It was a spiritual and social chaos. It was the sound of a community's foundational myth, the myth of the safe, idyllic island sanctuary, shattering into 1,000 irreparable pieces. The husband's decision to attack his family and then to Ketlu, to end his own life, was the final, violent rejection of the social contract. In the wake of such an event, a community doesn't just recover. It adapts to a new, darker reality where the person across the table, the person in the next house, or the person in the mirror is capable of an unfathomable betrayal.
This lead US to the hurt of the cô lập tại các vùng xa xôi, the isolating in the remote area.
We have discussed this as a geographical fact, a matter of miles and ocean currents. But as we reflect on the legacy of 2010, we must recognize isolation as a psychological weapon. Isolation is what happens when the warning bell rings and there is no one there to hear it. It is the state of being unreachable, not because of a lack of roads or boats, but because of a lack of empathy and infrastructure. The victims in Lyon were trapped in a double isolation, the physical isolation of their island and the social isolation of their domestic situation. The husband, too, was isolated within the collapsing architecture of his own mind, suffering from a Kung Hong Suc Kotom then that was never named, never treated, and never acknowledged until it turned lethal. This triple layer of isolation created the perfect conditions for a massacre. It ensured that the Tran Kai Kich Leet could escalate into a slaughter without the possibility of a saving grace. Looking back from 2026, we see that the Hoi Chuang Can Bao of case number 5 has had a complicated resonance. In some ways, the world has changed. The digital revolution has reached even the most remote islands, and the silence that once shrouded domestic violence is being pierced by the connectivity of the modern age. But technology is a double-edged sword. While it allows for faster communication, it can also create new forms of digital isolation, where people are more connected to the world but more detached from their immediate neighbors. The fundamental issues of Baoluk Jia Den and untreated mental illness remain the same, often hidden behind new, digital facades. The 2010 tragedy remains a stark reminder that no amount of technology can replace the basic human necessity of localized, physical support systems. A person in crisis in a place like Lyon doesn't need a social media post. They need a trained counselor, a safe house, and a community that is empowered to intervene before the argument turns into an attack. The Vio Kung Han Lone scene of the crime is a metaphor for the state of social services in remote regions. It is a scene of desperation where the tools of daily life, the hung kai or weapons, are turned against the people they were meant to serve. In our final reflection, we must honor the victims by acknowledging the sheer terror of their final moments. They were not just statistics in a report, they were people who were failed by every level of the society they lived in. They were failed by a culture that prioritized privacy over safety, by a healthcare system that ignored the mind in favor of the body, and by a government that saw their distance from the mainland as a reason to provide fewer resources. Their deaths were a high price to pay for a warning bell that we are still trying to understand 16 years later. The blood-soaked floors of that house were a visceral indictment of a world that allows its most vulnerable citizens to slip through the cracks of geography. The husband's suicide, his too sat, remains the ultimate unanswered question of the case. It was a final act of control in a life that had become uncontrollable. By taking his own life, he ensured that the chaos he created would never be resolved in a way that provided closure for the survivors. He left behind a vacuum of answers, a space where the why will always be larger than the how. In the context of 2026, we see his suicide as the terminal symptom of a society that offers no exit for those suffering from extreme psychological distress. He was a man who saw no way forward and decided to take everyone he loved with him into the dark. This is the true horror of case number 5. It is a story of total despair, a despair so deep that it consumed an entire family and left a village reeling for generations. The legacy of his suicide is a permanent stain on the community's history, a reminder that the greatest threat to a community's peace is often the untreated pain of its own members. As we conclude this podcast series, we must return to the image of the ocean. The Pacific continues to wash the shores of Lyon, just as it did in 2010. It is a beautiful, indifferent force that cares nothing for the tragedies of the humans who live on its islands. But we are not indifferent. We tell the story of case number 5 because we have a responsibility to hear the Hoi Chuang Can Bao. We have a responsibility to look at the Gok Kwat, the dark corners of our society, and to shine a light into the isolation that breeds such violence. The story of the Lyon massacre is a call to action. It is a demand that we provide mental health resources to the remote, that we break the silence surrounding domestic violence, and that we never again allow geography to be an excuse for abandonment. The village of Lyon has survived the aftermath of 2010, but it has not forgotten. The warning bell still echoes in the way neighbors look out for one another, in the way local leaders discuss family welfare, and in the way the youth are taught about respect and emotional health. This is the only positive outcome of such a tragedy, the hard-won wisdom that comes from surviving the worst. The community has turned its grief into a form of resilience, a watchful peace that acknowledges the possibility of darkness while striving for the light. Case number 5 is a closed file in the archives, but it is an open wound in the heart of the island, a wound that serves as a reminder of the fragility of our social bonds and the absolute necessity of our commitment to one another. In the final moments of this exploration, we invite you to sit with the silence of Lyon. Not the heavy, terrifying silence of 2010, but a silence of reflection. Think of the wife who hoped for a better tomorrow. Think of the family members whose laughter once filled that home. And think of the man who lost his way in the fog of a mental health crisis. Their story is a tragedy, yes, but it is also a testament to the importance of the work we have yet to do.
As long as there are other people living in cô lập tại các vùng xa xôi, our job is not done.
As long as Bauluk Jia Din remains a hidden epidemic, our job is not done. And as long as the Hoi Chuang Can Bao continues to ring in the quiet places of the world, we must continue to listen. Case number 5 is now part of our collective history, a grim mile marker on the road toward a more empathetic and connected world. We have walked through the chaos, analyzed the investigation, and reflected on the consequences. We have seen the Vio Kung Han Lon Va Dam Mao reality of a family destroyed, and we have heard the fierce argument that started it all. But in the end, what remains is the human spirit, the spirit of the survivors who continue to live, the spirit of the investigators who sought the truth, and the spirit of all those who hear this story and vow to make a difference. The tragedy of Lyon was a failure of the world to protect its own, but the legacy of Lyon can be a promise that we will do better. As we sign off from this deep dive into the archives of 2010, let the memory of the victims be a light in the dark. Let their story be a reminder that no one is truly alone as long as there is someone willing to tell their story and someone willing to listen. The waves of the Pacific will continue to hit the shore, and the sun will continue to rise over Lyon, but the warning bell will never truly be silenced. It will remain as a haunting, beautiful note in the music of the islands, a reminder that even in the most remote corners of the world, our lives are intertwined, and our responsibilities to one another are as deep and as vast as the ocean itself. Thank you for walking this difficult path with us. May we all find the courage to hear the bells before they ring for us, and may we all find the strength to bridge the gaps of isolation that still divide our world. This was case number 5, the murder-suicide at Lyon. A tragedy, a warning, and a legacy that will never be forgotten. Farewell, and stay vigilant in the quiet places. The date is Friday, May 8th, 2026, and as the morning sun casts long, golden shadows across the Pacific, we find ourselves standing at the final threshold of a journey that began 16 years ago in the village of Lyon. Case number 5 is no longer a breaking news story, nor is it the subject of immediate, frantic investigation. In the span of a decade and a half, it has transitioned into the realm of local lore and academic study, a dark milestone in the history of remote island communities. Yet, for those of us who have meticulously traced the arc of this tragedy, from the first sparks of a fierce argument to the final, devastating silence of a murder-suicide, the passage of time has not dulled the sharp edges of the horror. As we close this extensive record, we must engage in a final, profound meditation on what it means to remember a tragedy that was born from isolation and ended in an absolute, self-contained destruction. The story of Leon in 2010 is not just a chronicle of death. It is a permanent interrogation of our collective failure to hear the warning bells that ring in the most distant reaches of our world. To look back at Leon from the vantage point of 2026 is to recognize that the Vio Kung Han Lon Va Dam Mao scene described by the first responders was merely the physical manifestation of a much deeper, systemic chaos. We often think of chaos as something loud and visible, but the chaos of case number 5 was a silent, creeping thing that inhabited the spaces between people. It was the chaos of a marriage that had become a battlefield, the chaos of a mind that had lost its anchor, and the chaos of a village that was too close to see the danger and too far from help to stop it. The fierce argument between the husband and wife was the final collision of these invisible forces. In the 16 years since, we have learned to look closer at such arguments, realizing that they are rarely about the immediate subject of dispute. They are the sound of a structural collapse. In Leon, that collapse was total. It didn't just end a marriage, it erased a family. And because the perpetrator chose to Ketlu, the act of self-termination, the community was left to process that chaos without the stabilizing influence of a trial or a public accounting. The Hoi Chuang Kan Bao, or the warning bell, remains the most haunting metaphor of this entire case. A bell implies a sound meant to alert, to wake, to save. But the tragedy of 2010 was that the bell rang in a vacuum. The isolation of the remote islands created a soundproof room where the cries of the victims and the unraveling of the husband's sanity were contained until it was too late. As we reflect on this in 2026, we must ask if the world has become any better at listening. We live in an age of hyperconnectivity, yet the collapse or isolation described in case number 5 is still a reality for many. It is not just a matter of physical distance. It is the isolation of stigma, the isolation of poverty, and the isolation of being unseen by the central authorities. The consequence of this isolation in Leon was a blood-soaked house and a village in shock. The legacy of that warning bell is the persistent, uncomfortable question of how many other bells are ringing right now in the quiet villages of the Pacific, unheard by the world outside.
Theo được viết of bạo lực gia đình and sức khỏe tâm thần con tin to be the primary lesson of case number 5.
In 2010, the husband was a man without a map, lost in a psychological landscape that he didn't understand and that his community couldn't navigate. His Kung Hong Suc Ko Tom then was a slow-motion catastrophe that was allowed to reach its terminal stage because there were no local resources to intercept it. When we talk about domestic violence in the context of Leon, we are talking about a tragedy that was facilitated by a lack of alternatives. The victims had no place to run, no one to call, and no societal permission to speak their truth. The fierce argument was the final act of a play that had been running for years in the dark. The aftermath of the case has forced a global conversation about the necessity of bringing mental health services and domestic violence support to the Hondao Xa Zoi, but the work is far from finished. The story of Leon is a reminder that when we ignore the mental health of individuals in isolated communities, we are essentially leaving a loaded weapon in a room full of people. Reflecting on the Vio Kung Han Lon scene, we must also consider the role of the village itself. In a small community like Leon, everyone is a witness, even if they don't see the blood. The trauma of 2010 didn't just belong to the victims. It became the property of every person who lived within earshot of that house. The consequence of a murder-suicide in such a tight-knit environment is a form of collective PTSD. The neighbors who remembered the family, who saw them every day, and who heard the echoes of their final argument, were left with a wound that no forensic report could heal. This is the Hao Qua that lasts for generations. In 2026, there are young adults in Leon who were just children when the massacre happened, and they have grown up in a village that was redefined by that night. They are the living legacy of case number 5, a generation that understands the fragility of the paradise they inhabit. They know that the ocean can be a wall, and that the silence of a neighbor's house can be a sign of the most profound terror. The physical site of the tragedy in Leon serves as a final, silent witness. Whether the house still stands or has been replaced, the land remembers. The chaotic and bloody reality of 2010 has been absorbed into the geography of the island. In our work as true crime chroniclers, we often focus on the mechanics of the crime, the hung kai, the timeline, the evidence. But in this final part, we must focus on the absence. The absence of the family that should have grown old in that house. The absence of the children who should have been playing on the shore today, in 2026. The absence of the husband who should have been helped before he became a murderer. This void is the true result of the case. It is a silence that cannot be filled by any amount of analysis or storytelling. It is the silence of a family that was simply stopped. As we conclude this 8,000-word journey, we must address the tusat, or suicide, of the perpetrator one last time. In many ways, his decision to end his own life was the final act of isolation. He took the why with him, leaving the survivors to piece together a puzzle with missing pieces. In the world of 2026, we are better at understanding the suicide-homicide dynamic, but the emotional impact remains devastatingly the same. It is the ultimate refusal to be held accountable, a final assertion of power that leaves the victim's memories in a state of permanent unrest. The husband's suicide turned case number 5 into a closed book that no one could ever truly finish reading. It ensured that the chaos he created would never be resolved in a court of law, leaving only the Hoi Chuang Can Bao as his enduring contribution to history. It is a grim, heavy ending to a story that never should have had a beginning. The village of Leon, May 8, 2026. The sun is now high in the sky, and the Pacific is a brilliant, shimmering blue. It is a beautiful day, much like the day before the tragedy in 2010 must have been. Life goes on as it always does. The village has found a way to carry the weight of its past, and the lessons of case number 5 have been woven into the fabric of the community. There is more awareness now, more willingness to talk about the gak kwat, and a deeper understanding of the need for mutual support.
It
is a part of the island's identity, a dark thread in a vibrant tapestry. We tell this story not to reopen the wounds of Leon, but to ensure that the warning bell never stops ringing in our ears. We tell it to remind ourselves that isolation is a choice we make as a society, and it is a choice we can unmake. This final chapter is a tribute to the victims of 2010, to the wife, whose name may be lost to some but whose suffering is recorded here, to the family members whose lives were ended in a whirlwind of violence, to the community of Leon, which had to find the strength to continue after the darkness fell. We close this file with the hope that by documenting the Hoi Chuang Can Bao so thoroughly, we have contributed in some small way to preventing the next tragedy. The story of case number 5 is a story of failure, but it is also a story of the absolute necessity of human connection. As we sign off, let us look at the Hondao Xe Zoi not as a place of abandonment, but as a place that deserves our most intense vigilance and care. Let us listen for the bells, wherever they may be ringing, and let us have the courage to bridge the gaps of isolation before the silence becomes permanent. The ocean continues to wash the shores of Leon, a rhythmic, eternal pulse that outlasts all human tragedies. The salt air continues to bite at the wood and stone of the village, a slow erosion that mirrors the way memory softens with time. But case number 5 will not be eroded. It remains a fixed point in the landscape, a reminder of the day the paradise broke. In 2026, we look back not with a sense of distance, but with a sense of urgency.
The vô cùng hỗn loạn và đẫm máu Village of 2010 a possibility for any community that to silence interventi.
May we all be brave enough to speak into that silence. May we all be wise enough to hear the fierce argument as a cry for help. And may the village of Leon finally find the peace that was so violently stolen from it 16 years ago. This is the end of the file. Case number 5. The murder-suicide at Leon. Closed, but never forgotten. The warning bell has been rung. Now, finally, we can only hope the world is listening. The conclusion of a long-form true crime investigation is often the most difficult stage to navigate because it requires us to reconcile the clinical aftermath with the permanent emotional vacuum left behind. As we continue to look back from this Friday in May 2026, the tragedy of case number 5 in Lyon remains a haunting architectural study of a collapse that was as much societal as it was personal. We have spent 10 chapters dissecting the blood-soaked chaos, the fierce arguments, and the systemic failures of mental health and social isolation. Now, in this 11th segment, we must turn our gaze toward the invisible residue that such a massacre leaves on the land itself and on the very concept of home in a remote island community. When a man turns a weapon against his own family and then terminates his own life, he does more than commit a crime. He poisons the well of communal trust. In a village as small and secluded as Lyon, the aftermath is not something that can be swept away with the cleaning of a crime scene. It becomes a localized ghost, a permanent warning bell that continues to vibrate in the silence of the Pacific. To understand the enduring nature of this tragedy, we must revisit the concept of the fierce argument through a lens of 2026 sociological insight. In 2010, the witnesses described a dispute that was kitschlit, intense and violent in its verbal nature. At the time, this was perhaps seen as a domestic peak, a singular moment of explosion. But 16 years later, we recognize it as the final, audible symptom of a long-term psychological erosion. In isolated regions, where external stimulation is limited and the social circle is a tight, unyielding loop, a domestic dispute is never just between two people. It is a performance enacted within a pressure cooker. The husband's mental state, described as a state of kung hong suc ko tom then, was the result of a mind trapped in a vacuum. Without the intervention of modern psychiatric care or the release valve of a broader social network, his internal world became a hall of mirrors, where every perceived slight from his wife or family was magnified 1,000 times. The fierce argument was not the start of the violence. It was the moment the internal pressure finally shattered the glass. The description of the scene as Vio Kung Han Lon Va Dam Mao, exceedingly chaotic and bloody, is a phrase that carries a specific, heavy weight in the history of Lyon. When we speak of chaos in a true crime context, we are often referring to the physical disarray of a struggle, the overturned furniture, and the evidence of a desperate fight for survival. But in Lyon, the chaos was also moral. It was the complete subversion of the island's social order. In a remote village, the family is the ultimate unit of survival. To see that unit destroyed from within is to witness the collapse of the world itself. The blood that soaked the floors of that house in 2010 was not just biological evidence, it was the lifeblood of a community. The consequence of this, Han Lon, was a permanent shift in how the villagers of Lyon perceived their own safety. They learned that the most terrifying monster was not a stranger coming from the mainland, but the familiar face across the dinner table, driven to madness by the very isolation that was supposed to be their sanctuary. The act of Tu Ket Lu, the perpetrator's suicide, remains the most frustrating punctuation mark in the entire saga of case number 5. In the 16 years since the event, legal experts and psychologists have used this case to highlight the coward's exit that often accompanies domestic massacres. By taking his own life, the husband effectively silenced the only voice that could have provided a definitive why. He left the village of Lyon with a puzzle that could never be completed. This lack of a trial, this absence of a public sentencing, meant that there was no symbolic cleaning of the village's spirit. The community was denied the catharsis of seeing justice served. Instead, they were left with the raw, unresolved trauma of the chaotic scene. This is the specific burden of murder-suicides in remote areas. The perpetrator becomes a permanent, unpunished shadow over the village, a man whose final act was to escape the very world he had just destroyed. The Hoi Chuang Kan Bao, or the warning bell that rang in 2010, is still ringing in 2026, though its tone has changed from a frantic alarm to a steady, somber tolling. We must reflect on whether the Han Dao Xe Zoi, the remote islands, are any safer now than they were back then. While communication technology has improved, the core issue of collap or isolation remains a physical reality. You can have a smartphone in your hand, but if the nearest psychiatric crisis center is a 12-hour boat ride away, you are still living in the dark. The tragedy of Leon was a failure of geography as much as a failure of humanity. It showed us that when we abandon the remote corners of our world to their own devices, we are essentially gambling with the lives of the people who live there. The blood-soaked chaos of 2010 was the price of that gamble. As we conclude this part of our investigation, we must confront the reality that for every Leon that makes the headlines, there are a dozen other villages currently living in the shadow of a similar, silent escalation. The victims of case number 5, the wife and the family members, deserve to be remembered not as the tragic footnotes of a madman's breakdown, but as individuals who were failed by a system that was supposed to protect them. They were the casualties of a culture that values privacy over safety and a government that views the remote islands as out of sight, out of mind. Their final moments, trapped in that house during the fierce argument, are a testament to the absolute vulnerability of those who live at the edge of the world. In 2026, we honor their memory by continuing to ring the bell they could not reach. We honor them by refusing to lang man hoa, to romanticize the isolation of the islands. We must see Leon for what it was, a beautiful place where a family was allowed to die in total silence because the world wasn't listening. The husband's background, though sparsely documented in the original reports, suggests a man who was a victim of his own environment before he became a victimizer. In a place like Leon, a man's identity is often tied to his ability to provide and lead his family. When mental illness strikes, it is viewed as a shameful defect rather than a medical crisis. The Kung Hong Suc Ko Tom then was likely a slow, agonizing process of losing himself, a process that was hidden behind the stoic facade required by island life. By the time the Tran Kai Kich Leet occurred, he was likely already gone, replaced by a hollow shell of rage and despair. His suicide was the final, tragic confirmation of this emptiness. The tragedy of Leon is the story of a man who broke, a family that suffered, and a village that had to watch it all happen in slow motion. As the sun continues its path across the sky on this May Day in 2026, the village of Leon remains a place of profound beauty and profound sorrow. The house where the massacre occurred may have been torn down, or it may be standing as a weathered reminder of 2010, but the impact of case number 5 is inescapable. The hao qua, or consequences, are seen in the way the local authorities now prioritize domestic intervention and the way the island's healthcare providers have fought for better mental health funding. The tragedy served as a brutal education for the entire region. It taught them that Bao Luc Jia Din is not a private matter, that mental health is a public safety issue, and that isolation is a dangerous luxury. The warning bell that rang in Leon has finally been heard, but the cost was far too high. We are left with the image of the Pacific, a vast blue graveyard that has seen so many stories end in silence. Case number 5 is one of those stories, but it is one that we refuse to let disappear. By documenting every detail of the chaotic and bloody scene, by analyzing the fierce argument, and by reflecting on the suicide of the perpetrator, we are keeping the light on in that dark corner of the world. We are ensuring that the family who died in Leon is not forgotten and that their tragedy continues to serve as a call to action. True crime storytelling at its best is not about the thrill of the horror. It is about the solemn responsibility of the witness. We are the witnesses to the 2010 tragedy, and our testimony is that this must never happen again. The story of Leon is a narrative of limits, the limits of human endurance, the limits of a community's ability to protect its own, and the limits of our social safety nets. When the husband used that hung kai against his family, he showed us the terrifying reality of what happens when those limits are breached. The Vo Kung Han Lon that followed was the sound of a world breaking. 16 years later, we're still trying to mend that break. We are still trying to build a world where the remote islands are not forgotten islands. As we conclude this 11th part of our deep dive into case number 5, we are reminded that the work of empathy and intervention is never truly finished. The warning bell is still ringing, and it is up to us to decide how we will answer. Leon, 2010 will forever be synonymous with a family's destruction and a man's descent into madness. But in 2026, it must also be synonymous with our commitment to change. We have looked at the blood-soaked chaos and refused to look away. We have listened to the fierce argument and recognized it as a cry for help that was never answered. And we have stood at the site of the suicide and realized that the only way to find justice is to prevent the next tragedy. The file on case number 5 remains open in our minds, a constant reminder that in the most isolated corners of the world, we are the only safety net that exists for one another. The silence of Leon is no longer empty. It is filled with the stories of the victims, and it is our duty to keep telling them until the warning bell is no longer needed. Stay with us as we move into the final reflections on this case, remembering that every word we write is a stone in the bridge we are building to reach those who are still trapped in the dark.